What if I told you that in 1590, 115 American colonists, including pregnant women and newborn babies, vanished without a trace from what is now North Carolina, leaving behind only a single word carved into wood, Croatoan. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, no explanation, just gone. Like they were abducted by aliens, except this actually happened. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. This disappearance happened 17 years before the Jamestown colony was even established. These people literally vanished before America was officially America. They were the beta testers of the American dream, and they just glitched out of existence. Picture this nightmare scenario. You wake up tomorrow morning and your entire neighborhood is empty. Every single house, but not empty like people moved out, empty like they vanished mid-meal. Coffee cups still warm, car keys on the counter, cell phones charging by the bed. The only clue, a single word spray painted on the stop sign, Croatoan. That's essentially what John White found when he returned to Roanoke Island in 1590, except instead of modern suburbia, it was America's first English settlement. We're talking about 115 real people here, not some Netflix horror show. Pregnant women who crossed the Atlantic Ocean in wooden death traps. Children born in the New World who disappeared before they could even walk. Fathers who sold everything they owned, and I mean everything, to buy a one-way ticket to what they thought would be the American dream. Instead, they became America's first missing persons case. And guys, we still have absolutely no idea what happened to them. The numbers alone should make your skin crawl. 115 people. That's more than twice the number of passengers on a typical commercial flight. Imagine if an entire Boeing 737 just vanished. Not crashed. Vanished. With no wreckage, no distress signals, no trace. The media would lose their minds. The investigation would never end. But in 1590, 115 people could just disappear into the American wilderness and stay disappeared for over 400 years. And here's the part that'll keep you up at night: they left behind almost nothing. No skeletons buried in secret graves, no desperate final letters explaining their fate, no evidence of violence, disease, or natural disaster, just systematic proof that they carefully packed up their entire lives and walked into the unknown. The only forwarding address, one cryptic word that's been driving historians insane for 4 centuries. But wait, it gets worse. Among those 115 vanished souls was Virginia Dare, literally the first English child born in America. She was 9 days old when her grandfather sailed away to get help. She was barely 3 years old when she vanished along with everyone else. Virginia Dare was patient zero of the American identity, and she just disappeared. Think about that. The very first American simply evaporated from history. Alright folks, welcome back to the channel where we dive headfirst into the mysteries that shaped America. The stories they definitely don't teach in your AP history class because they're way too disturbing and weird for standardized testing. I'm talking about the real, unfiltered, absolutely bonkers truth behind American history. I'm your host, and tonight we're going back to 1587, not to some exotic pyramid in Egypt or mysterious castle in Europe, but to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Because sometimes the most mind-bending mysteries happen in the most ordinary American places. And trust me, this story is about to make the Bermuda Triangle look like a kiddie pool. We're about to explore the unvarnished, uncensored truth behind America's first missing persons case. And when I say unvarnished, I mean we're talking about real people who tried to build new lives in the New World and just vanished. Real families who faced genuine terror, uncertainty, and ultimately a fate that's been baffling everyone for over 4 centuries. This isn't some sanitized textbook version where everyone learns valuable lessons about perseverance and cooperation. This is the raw, complicated, often absolutely terrifying reality of what it meant to be a pioneer when America was still a mysterious frontier and crossing the Atlantic was basically like volunteering for a one-way mission to Mars. Except Mars doesn't have cannibals, probably. And here's what makes this story even more insane. We have more evidence about what happened to the dinosaurs 65 million years ago than we do about what happened to 115 English colonists in 1587. Think about that for a second. We can track asteroid impacts from before mammals existed, but we can't figure out where a group of families went when they had horses, boats, and written language. If you're into mysteries that have been haunting investigators for longer than America has been a country, absolutely demolish that like button. Seriously, this video is about to blow your mind so hard, you'll need to ice your skull. And subscribe if you want more deep dives into America's most disturbing historical enigmas. Because trust me, we've got a whole basement full of nightmare fuel where this came from. Alright, grab your favorite drink, maybe something strong, because this story gets dark. Get comfortable, maybe dim the lights if you're feeling brave. We're about to take a journey back to colonial America, when maps were basically medieval fantasy drawings with sea monsters. Medical knowledge consisted of just bleed the patient until they feel better, and the most advanced technology was a wooden boat that had about a 50-50 chance of not sinking. And I guarantee you, after tonight you'll understand why this story has inspired hundreds of books, dozens of movies, TV shows, conspiracy theories, and probably a few nervous breakdowns among historians. You'll also probably feel incredibly grateful for modern conveniences like GPS cell service, emergency services, and the fact that when you move to a new neighborhood, you don't have to worry about the locals potentially wanting to murder you and wear your skin as a hat. But fair warning, this story involves real people who faced genuine pants-wetting terror and uncertainty. We're going to treat their experiences with the respect they deserve, while also acknowledging that sometimes history is stranger, more disturbing, and more inexplicable than any horror movie ever made. And here's a fun fact that'll mess with your head. The technology gap between us and the Roanoke colonists is smaller than the gap between the colonists and the ancient Romans. Let that sink in. These people were closer to Caesar than they were to us, and they were trying to establish a permanent settlement in unknown territory using what was essentially medieval technology. So let's travel back to the late 1500s, when America existed more in European fever dreams than reality. When crossing the Atlantic meant months in a wooden coffin with sails, no communication with home, and no guarantee you'd ever see your family again. When 115 English colonists were about to become part of the most disturbing mystery in American history. We're going to follow their story from the very beginning, from the delusional dreams and get-rich-quick schemes that brought them to America, through their desperate attempt at building new lives in a place that wanted them dead, to that final bone-chilling moment when they simply disappeared into the American wilderness, leaving behind only questions that we're still trying to answer today. Because this isn't just a story about what happened to one group of unfortunate colonists. This is a story about human nature, about what people do when everything goes catastrophically wrong, about the terrifying fragility of civilization, and about the power of mystery to haunt our collective imagination across centuries. And here's the kicker, by the end of this journey you might just develop your own theory about what really happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke. But I'm warning you now, once this mystery gets its hooks in you, it never lets go. There's a reason historians have been losing sleep over this for 400 years. But first, we need to understand how 115 people ended up in the middle of nowhere, completely cut off from civilization, with no backup plan and no way to call for help. Because their story doesn't start with mystery, it starts with the kind of spectacular overconfidence and poor planning that would make a modern entrepreneur blush. Let's set the scene, and I want you to really picture this because it's absolutely insane. It's the 1580s, and England is having what we'd call a major case of FOMO. They've just defeated the Spanish Armada, basically the 16th century equivalent of winning the Super Bowl. And Queen Elizabeth is running the show like a boss. But here's the thing that's eating at every English entrepreneur: Spain has been absolutely crushing it in the New World for decades. We're talking about Spain pulling literal shiploads of gold and silver out of South America, while England sits there like the neighbor watching someone else win the lottery every single week. Spanish galleons are sailing home loaded with enough treasure to make Jeff Bezos jealous, and England is basically broke in comparison. So naturally, English business minds start thinking, you know what, why should Spain have all the fun? Unless... Enter Sir Walter Raleigh, who was essentially the Elon Musk of the 16th century, except instead of electric cars and space travel, he was obsessed with colonizing America. And just like modern tech billionaires, Raleigh had three crucial things: massive charm, powerful connections, in this case Queen Elizabeth herself, and most importantly access to other people's money. Lots of other people's money. But here's the business plan that Raleigh was selling to investors, and I kid you not, this was the actual pitch. So here's the deal, gentlemen. We take a bunch of people, families, craftsmen, farmers, whoever, we put them on boats. We sail them across an ocean that regularly kills people just for fun. We drop them off on a continent that we know almost nothing about. And then they'll find gold and send it back to us. Also, they'll probably find a passage to the Pacific Ocean and Asia, making us the richest people in Europe. What could go wrong? And somehow, this actually sounded like a reasonable investment to people with money. Think about that. These were supposedly smart businessmen who heard, let's send people to unknown lands to find gold that might not exist, and thought, yes, this is definitely where I want to put my life savings. The economics were brilliantly simple in theory. England needed wealth to compete with Spain and France. America supposedly had wealth just lying around waiting to be picked up. Gold, silver, precious stones, maybe some exotic spices. Therefore, England should go to America and pick up the wealth. The fact that nobody had actually seen this wealth lying around didn't seem to worry anyone too much. It was like investing in cryptocurrency based on a rumor you heard from your cousin's friend. But here's where it gets absolutely ridiculous. Raleigh had managed to get Queen Elizabeth to grant him a charter for basically the entire eastern seaboard of North America. They called it Virginia after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, which meant Raleigh technically owned everything from Florida to Canada. Or on paper, anyway. The actual inhabitants of these lands, the people who had been living there for thousands of years, weren't exactly consulted about this arrangement. Imagine if aliens landed on Earth tomorrow, and one of them announced, "Great news, I now own everything from New York to Los Angeles. I have official papers and everything. Sorry, didn't think to ask you humans first." That's essentially what European colonization looked like from the Native American perspective. But here's what makes this whole venture even more absolutely bonkers. They knew almost nothing about what they were getting into. Their maps of America were basically medieval fantasy drawings, complete with sea monsters, unicorns, and wild speculation. They had no idea about the climate. Imagine planning a camping trip without knowing if you're going to the desert or the Arctic. They had no clue about the geography, the native populations, the diseases, the animals, or really anything that might be useful for, not dying horrible deaths. Their technological situation was like trying to colonize Antarctica using camping equipment from a Renaissance fair. They'd be crossing the Atlantic in wooden boats that were vulnerable to storms, navigation errors, pirate sea monsters according to their maps, and just general oceanic hostility. Once they got to America, if they got to America, they'd have no way to communicate with England except by sending another boat back, which might or might not make it. Might or might not find England, and might or might not arrive, before everyone in America starved to death. Medical knowledge was so primitive that they thought disease was caused by bad air and could be cured by bleeding people until they felt better, or died, whichever came first. Their understanding of nutrition was so poor that they regularly died of scurvy, despite having access to foods that could prevent it. These were people who were essentially planning to sail off and colonize an entire continent using the technological sophistication of medieval farmers with delusions of grandeur. And the cultural preparation even worse. They had absolutely no understanding of Native American societies, politics, languages, or customs. They didn't speak any native languages. They had no idea how to grow American crops, hunt American animals, or survive American winters. They were essentially planning to show up in someone else's homeland and wing it. The financial pressure made everything infinitely worse. These weren't government expeditions funded by taxes. They were private ventures that needed to show a profit, or everyone involved would go bankrupt. Investors wanted returns on their investment, which meant the colonists needed to find valuable resources quickly. There was no long-term plan for sustainable settlement, no backup strategies, no plan B. Just a desperate hope that they'd stumble onto something valuable enough to justify the enormous expense before they all died. Raleigh was essentially selling the colonial equivalent of beachfront property in Florida to people who'd never seen an ocean. He painted pictures of a land flowing with gold and precious stones populated by friendly natives, eager to trade, blessed with perfect climate and soil, so fertile you could grow money trees. The promotional materials made America sound like a cross between the Garden of Eden and a shopping mall where everything was free. The reality, as we'll see, was somewhat different, like apocalyptically different. The cost of mounting a colonial expedition was absolutely staggering by 16th century standards. You needed ships capable of crossing the Atlantic, which cost about as much as buying a small town. You needed supplies for months at sea, food, water, medicine, tools, weapons, trade goods. You needed equipment for building settlements from scratch in a wilderness. You needed enough food to keep people alive until they could grow their own, assuming they could figure out how to farm in completely different soil with completely different climate. All of this had to be paid for up front, with no guarantee of any return on investment. It was like starting a business where you had to spend millions of dollars before you even knew if your product would work, if there were any customers, or if your factory would be burned down by angry locals. But the potential rewards seemed enormous, at least on paper. If you could establish a successful colony in America, you'd have access to whatever resources the continent contained. You'd have a base for privateering against Spanish ships, basically legalized piracy. You'd have a strategic foothold in the New World for future expansion. And most importantly, if you found gold or silver or a passage to Asia, you'd be richer than entire European kingdoms. So when Raleigh started recruiting for his colonial venture, he found plenty of takers, people who were willing to risk everything, their money, their families, their lives, for the chance at a better life in America. People who believed the promotional materials about the New World being a land of unlimited opportunity. People who had no idea they were essentially volunteering to be test subjects in one of history's most dangerous experiments. These weren't desperate criminals or social outcasts. These were middle-class English families, craftsmen, farmers, professionals, people with real skills for building a functioning community. They sold their homes, their businesses, their possessions. They said goodbye to everyone they'd ever known. They boarded ships for a journey they knew might kill them, to reach a destination they knew almost nothing about, to start lives they had no idea how to live. Think about the courage that required, or the desperation, or maybe just the spectacular overconfidence of people who thought they could succeed, where logic suggested they'd probably die horribly. These people were about to learn that the gap between promotional materials and reality can sometimes be measured in body counts. In 1585, Raleigh decided to test the waters with what was essentially a military reconnaissance mission disguised as a colony. And when I say test the waters, I mean he sent 107 men to establish a permanent English presence on Roanoke Island, with about as much planning as a college spring break trip. Notice I said men, no women, no children, no families. This should have been the first massive red flag, that this wasn't really about permanent settlement. Think of it like sending a bunch of Navy SEALs to open a Starbucks in downtown Baghdad. They might be excellent at warfare, but running a sustainable coffee business that requires a completely different skill set, and expecting them to maintain friendly relationships with the locals while establishing a permanent commercial presence. That's just asking for disaster. The expedition was led by Ralph Lane, who had extensive military experience, but apparently the cultural sensitivity of a brick and the diplomatic skills of a honey badger with anger management issues. Lane's approach to colonization was basically show up with superior weapons, intimidate the locals into submission, take whatever you need, and hope England sends more supplies before you run out of food. It was Imperialism 101, and it was about to go spectacularly wrong. The choice of Roanoke Island should have been another glaring warning sign, visible from space. They picked it because it was defensible, surrounded by water, easy to fortify, difficult for enemies to attack. What they completely failed to consider is that all those same defensive features made it incredibly difficult to resupply and absolutely terrible for farming. The soil was sandy, and poor freshwater was limited, and the island was basically a glorified sandbar in the middle of nowhere. It was like trying to build a sustainable city on Alcatraz. Sure, you're safe from land-based attacks, but good luck getting groceries delivered, growing food, or maintaining any kind of normal economic activity. The island that was supposed to protect them was actually a prison that would slowly starve them to death. But here's where the cultural ignorance really starts to show. The colonists arrived to find themselves in the middle of an incredibly complex political situation that they completely failed to understand, kind of like Americans trying to navigate Middle Eastern politics without speaking the language or understanding the history. The Outer Banks were home to various Algonquian-speaking peoples who had their own political relationships, territorial disputes, trade networks, and strategic concerns that had been developing for centuries. The English basically wandered into this situation like tourists who accidentally stumbled into a neighborhood gang war and started making demands about where they wanted to set up their hot dog stand. The local chief was named Wingina, who later changed his name to Pemisipan after the English arrived, and that name change should have been a hint about how he felt about his new neighbors. Wingina was trying to navigate an absolutely impossible situation. How do you deal with these strange, heavily armed foreigners who clearly don't understand local customs, don't speak your language, seem to expect you to feed them, and appear to think they own the place? Imagine aliens landing in your backyard, setting up camp, and expecting you to provide free room and board while they establish their mining operation or whatever the hell they're doing. Then imagine they have superior weapons and a tendency to get violent when they don't get what they want. That's essentially what Wingina was dealing with, except the aliens were English and they smelled really bad from months at sea. The cultural misunderstandings started immediately and got worse every day. The English expected the Native Americans to provide them with food, essentially treating them like a free catering service that should be grateful for the privilege of feeding foreign invaders. The Native Americans, reasonably enough, expected some kind of reciprocal relationship, trade alliance, mutual benefit, basic human courtesy. Instead, they got demands backed by superior weaponry and threats of violence. The food situation became critical almost immediately, and this is where Lane's complete lack of planning really started to show. The colonists had arrived too late in the season to plant crops, assuming they even knew how to grow American crops in American soil with American climate, which they didn't. They had brought some supplies from England, but not nearly enough to last until the next growing season. Their survival strategy was basically show up and figure it out later, so they essentially showed up expecting room service in the wilderness. When room service wasn't forthcoming from their involuntary hosts, they decided the solution was to rob the neighbors at gunpoint. This is not typically considered a sustainable business model, but Lane was about to give it his best shot. Ralph Lane's leadership style was perfectly suited for a military campaign against a foreign enemy, but completely inappropriate for building a sustainable community in someone else's homeland. When the Native Americans couldn't or wouldn't provide enough food to keep 107 English soldiers fed through the winter Lane's solution was to make increasingly aggressive demands backed by increasingly explicit threats of violence. Lane managed to turn what could have been a delicate diplomatic situation requiring cultural sensitivity and mutual respect into a full-blown neighborhood feud with racial undertones and superior firepower. Instead of trying to understand local customs, build relationships, and establish mutually beneficial trade agreements, he treated the Native Americans like subjects who owed him tribute for the privilege of having armed foreigners living in their territory. The situation escalated throughout 1585 and early 1586, with tensions rising every day. The colonists were hungry and getting hungrier. The Native Americans were fed up with their demanding increasingly hostile and apparently permanent guests, and Lane was becoming more and more convinced that the solution to every problem was more intimidation and more threats of violence. Think about this from both perspectives for a minute. You've got 107 English soldiers who are slowly starving on an island completely cut off from any source of supplies, surrounded by people they don't understand and can't communicate with effectively. Every day they don't get adequate food is a day closer to death. On the other side, you've got Native American communities who are being pressured to feed foreign invaders who offer nothing in return except threats and violence. Every day they comply with English demands is a day they reinforce the idea that they can be bullied and exploited. It was a powder keg waiting for someone to light the fuse, and Ralph Lane was walking around with the torch. In the spring of 1586, Lane decided he'd had enough of diplomacy and cultural sensitivity. He made the decision to launch what was essentially a preemptive strike against Chief Pimicipant. Lane invited the chief to a meeting under the pretense of peaceful negotiation, and then assassinated him in what was basically a medieval version of a mob hit. Lane's men then went on a rampage, burning native villages, terrorizing the local population, and basically declaring war on everyone within a 50-mile radius. Lane's solution to running out of groceries was essentially to rob and murder the neighbors, steal their food, and hope the survivors would be too terrified to fight back. This is not typically considered a sustainable business model in any century, but Lane was apparently willing to give it a shot. The violence solved exactly nothing and made everything infinitely worse. Now the colonists were completely surrounded by people who had every reason to want them dead, and no reason to show mercy. They were still running out of food. They had no reliable source of supplies. They had burned their bridges with the local population both literally and figuratively, and they had managed to turn potential allies into definite enemies who knew the terrain and outnumbered them significantly. At this point, the colony was essentially doomed. They were trapped on an island surrounded by hostile forces who wanted revenge, running out of food with no way to contact England for help, and no hope of establishing the kind of productive relationships they needed for long-term survival. If Lane had been trying to create the worst possible situation for English colonization, he couldn't have done a better job if he'd been secretly working for the Spanish. But then, like a miracle straight out of a Hollywood movie, Sir Francis Drake showed up in June 1586. Drake was on his way back to England from raiding Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, basically government-sanctioned piracy, and decided to check on the Roanoke settlement as a favor to Raleigh. What he found was a group of desperate, starving men under siege by people they were supposed to be living peacefully alongside. Picture the scene. Drake's ships appear on the horizon like cavalry arriving just before the fort gets overrun. Inside the fort, 107 English soldiers are probably preparing for their last stand against an entire regional population that wants them dead. Drake steps ashore to find what was supposed to be a thriving English colony, and instead discovers what looks like the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse, except the zombies won. Drake offered the colonists passage back to England, and they couldn't abandon the island fast enough. The entire colony, every single person, boarded Drake's ships and sailed away, leaving behind their fort, their supplies, their equipment, and their dream of English America. They basically called the 16th century equivalent of an Uber to escape a really bad vacation, except the vacation had involved multiple murders and the very real possibility of being scalped in retaliation. The 1585 Roanoke colony was a complete unmitigated disaster from start to finish, but it did teach some valuable lessons about what not to do when trying to establish a settlement in someone else's homeland. Or at least it should have taught some valuable lessons. An all-male military colony was clearly unsustainable for permanent settlement. You couldn't build a thriving community by antagonizing the people you needed to trade with for survival. You needed to be self-sufficient in food production from day one. You absolutely had to maintain better relations with your neighbors if you wanted to survive more than one growing season. And maybe showing up with guns and demanding tribute wasn't the best way to introduce yourself to new neighbors. Unfortunately, as we'll see, the English didn't learn all of these lessons as thoroughly as they should have, because 2 years later they decided to try the exact same thing again, but with families this time. Because apparently, the problem wasn't the location, the planning, or the approach. It was just that they needed more people to make the same mistakes on a larger scale. After the spectacular failure of Ralph Lane's military colony, and I mean spectacular in the same way the Hindenburg was spectacular, you might think the English would give up on Roanoke Island. You would be wrong, dead wrong. Instead, they decided to try again, but this time with a completely different approach that was sure to work families. The logic seemed sound enough, at least in the boardrooms of London. Military colonies failed because soldiers aren't interested in building permanent communities. They're interested in completing missions and going home to England, where the beer doesn't taste like sadness and nobody's trying to scalp them. But families. Families have skin in the game. Families plant gardens they plan to harvest for years. Families build houses they plan to live in, not just use as temporary barracks. Families work to establish good relationships with neighbors because they're not going anywhere. Enter John White, who was about to become both the hero and the most tragic figure in American colonial history. White had been with Ralph Lane's expedition as the artist and mapmaker, so he had front row seats to watch the military approach fail spectacularly. He witnessed every mistake, every cultural misunderstanding, every moment where things went wrong, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that he could do better. White was like the guy who survived a tech startup crash and decided to try again with better planning, more realistic expectations, and the inside knowledge of exactly what went wrong the first time. He had connections with potential investors, experience with the challenges they'd face, and a vision for how to make English colonization actually work instead of just creating more graves in the American wilderness. His plan was elegantly simple and seemed bulletproof. Instead of sending soldiers who wanted to go home, send families who wanted to make America their home. Instead of trying to intimidate the locals into submission, establish friendly relationships based on mutual benefit and cultural respect. Instead of depending on England for constant supplies, become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. Instead of treating colonization like a military conquest approach, it like building a new community from scratch. What could possibly go wrong? The plan called for 115 colonists, including 17 women and 9 children. These weren't adventurers or soldiers looking for quick wealth and glory. These were people who had sold everything they owned to buy passage to America. Craftsmen who knew how to build things, farmers who knew how to grow food, professionals with real skills for creating a functioning community. People who were literally betting their entire lives on the success of this venture. Think about what that meant in 1587. These people were going all in on America. They couldn't just change their minds and go back to England. If things didn't work out, they'd sold their homes, their businesses, their possessions. They'd said goodbye to everyone they'd ever known. They were crossing an ocean that regularly killed people just for fun to reach a destination they knew almost nothing about to start lives. They had no clear idea how to live. It was the ultimate leap of faith, except the landing zone was a wilderness that had already killed the previous group of English settlers. Among the colonists was John White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who was married to Ananias Dare and pregnant with what would become the first English child born in America. Picture this: Eleanor was basically a pregnant woman crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a wooden boat during the 16th century to start life in an untamed wilderness. The courage that required is almost incomprehensible by modern standards. Or maybe it was desperation, or maybe just the kind of blind optimism that makes people buy lottery tickets. The original plan called for the colony to be established in the Chesapeake Bay area, which had several major advantages over Roanoke Island. The Chesapeake had deeper harbors for supply ships, better farmland freshwater sources, and crucially, it wasn't the site of a previous colonial disaster, where everyone had nearly been killed by angry locals. It was basically a fresh start in a location that hadn't been contaminated by Ralph Lane's spectacular diplomatic failures. But plans, as they say, rarely survive contact with reality, especially when reality includes ship captains with their own agendas. The expedition's ship captain was Simon Fernandez, who turned out to be more interested in privateering essentially legalized piracy than in successfully transporting families to their new homes. Fernandez was supposed to be the Uber driver taking them to their destination, helping them establish their settlement, and then returning to England with reports of their progress. Instead, he treated the colonization mission like an annoying side job that was interfering with his real business of raiding Spanish ships and stealing their treasure. Fernandez was like having an Uber driver who keeps stopping to pick up other passengers for more profitable rides, instead of taking you where you actually need to go. Except in this case, the detours involved attacking Spanish vessels with cannons, and the passengers were families with small children who just wanted to get to their new home without being killed by pirates or storms or sea monsters. When the expedition reached Roanoke Island in July 1587, Fernandez announced that he was tired of playing taxi driver and wasn't going to take the colonists any further north to the Chesapeake Bay. He claimed that the late season made continuing to their planned destination too dangerous, but it's much more likely that he was eager to get back to the more profitable business of stealing Spanish gold. Time was money, and families weren't profitable, so he basically dumped the colonists at Roanoke Island, the site of the previous colonial failure, and sailed away to resume his piracy career. Imagine booking a flight to Disney World and getting dropped off at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere, with the pilot explaining that your original destination was too dangerous, before flying off to make money elsewhere. That's essentially what happened to 115 people who had sold everything they owned to start new lives in America. The colonists found themselves stuck at the scene of Ralph Lane's disaster. The fort was overgrown with vegetation and damaged by weather. There were still bones scattered around from Lane's failed expedition, literal human remains as a welcome mat. The local Native Americans had every reason to be suspicious of any new English arrivals, considering the previous English visitors had murdered their chief and burned their villages. It was like trying to rebuild a failed restaurant in the same building where the previous restaurant had gone spectacularly bankrupt, burned bridges with all the suppliers, and left a terrible reputation with every customer in town. Except instead of bad Yelp reviews, they were dealing with people who had very legitimate reasons to want all English settlers dead. But the colonists didn't have much choice in the matter. Winter was coming, they had families to shelter and feed, and Fernandez was already disappearing over the horizon with their only means of transportation. They would have to make Roanoke Island work regardless of its bloody history and all the practical problems that had doomed the previous attempt. The first priority was basic survival, repairing the damaged fort, building adequate shelter for 115 people, including children and pregnant women, and figuring out how to feed everyone through a Carolina winter. The second priority was somehow trying to repair the catastrophic damage that Ralph Lane had done to English-Native American relations. They needed to convince people who had very good reasons to hate and distrust all English settlers that this group was different, better, more peaceful, more respectful. Good luck with that sales pitch. Fortunately, they had one major asset that Lane's expedition had completely lacked: Monteo, a Native American from the Croatoan tribe who had traveled to England with an earlier expedition and served as an interpreter and cultural bridge between the two worlds. Monteo was essentially their only local friend in a very complicated and potentially hostile neighborhood, like having one person willing to vouch for you in a town where everyone else wants you gone. Monteo was baptized as a Christian and given the title Lord of Roanoke by the English, which was a nice gesture that probably didn't carry much weight with the local tribes who had their own ideas about who should be Lord of what. But his presence gave the colonists hope that they could establish better relationships with the local population than Lane had managed with his guns-first diplomacy never approach. Maybe this time the English could build a colony based on cooperation rather than intimidation. Maybe they could learn to live alongside Native Americans instead of trying to conquer them. Maybe they could create something sustainable instead of just creating more graves. On August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter whom they named Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. Virginia's birth was a moment of incredible hope and symbolism for the colony's future. Here was proof that English families could not only survive in America, but actually grow and prosper. Here was the next generation of Americans born free from the old world's problems and prejudices. Virginia Dare was literally the first American born into a situation that would make modern survival reality shows look like luxury spa vacations. She was baptized on August 24th, 1587, in what was essentially a wilderness fort, surrounded by forests, swamps, and people who had every reason to want her family to leave or die. Her birth certificate was probably carved into a tree. But even as they celebrated Virginia's birth and the hope she represented, the colonists were facing growing concerns about their supply situation. The food they had brought from England wasn't going to last through the winter, and they hadn't had time to establish adequate crops before the growing season ended. They needed help from England, and they needed it soon, or their symbol of hope would become a symbol of tragedy. This created a terrible, heartbreaking dilemma for John White. As the colony's leader and organizer, he was the only person with the authority and connections necessary to secure additional supplies from England. But leaving meant abandoning his daughter, his brand new granddaughter who was barely a week old, and the 113 other colonists who were depending on him for their survival. It was an impossible choice: stay with his family and watch the entire colony potentially starve to death, or leave his family and risk never seeing them again in order to save everyone. There were no good options, only terrible choices with potentially catastrophic consequences either way. The colonists eventually convinced White that he had to go back to England. They argued that without additional supplies, the entire colony would fail anyway, and then his family would die along with everyone else. Better for him to make the dangerous voyage back to England and return with help than for everyone to starve together while he watched, helplessly. On August 27, 1587, John White boarded a ship and sailed away from Roanoke Island, leaving behind his daughter, his granddaughter, who was barely 9 days old, and 113 other colonists. He promised to return as quickly as possible with the supplies they needed to survive. He had no way of knowing that he would never see any of them again. Before leaving, White and the colonists agreed on a communication system for staying in touch across the ocean. If the colonists had to move to a different location for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination into a prominent tree or post. If they were in danger or under attack, they would carve a cross above the location name as a distress signal. It was like leaving a note for the pizza delivery guy, except the stakes were life and death for everyone he loved, and the delivery might take 3 years. As White's ship disappeared over the horizon, the colonists settled in for what they hoped would be a brief wait for his return, with supplies and reinforcements. They had shelter, they had some food, they had a plan for survival, and they had hope that their situation would improve soon. What they didn't have was any idea that events in England were about to make their desperate situation infinitely worse, or that White's promise to return quickly was being derailed by forces completely beyond anyone's control. They were about to learn that sometimes hope isn't enough, and sometimes the people you're counting on can't save you, no matter how much they want to. The colonists of Roanoke were about to discover that in colonial America, you could do everything right and still end up as a cautionary tale that haunts people for centuries. After John White sailed away in late August 1587, the 115 remaining colonists faced the brutal reality of life in colonial America, without modern conveniences, reliable food sources, or any means of communication with the outside world. Think of it as the ultimate off-grid survival experience, except failure didn't mean just an uncomfortable camping trip. Failure meant death for you, your family, and your entire community. And we're not talking about Instagram-worthy off-grid living, where you still have solar panels and internet access. This was Stone Age survival, with Renaissance-era tools, in a climate they didn't understand, surrounded by wildlife that could kill them, dealing with diseases they couldn't treat, and trying to build a functioning society from absolute scratch. Virginia Dare's birth had been a moment of celebration and hope, but now the colonists had to face the practical challenges of keeping a newborn alive in a wilderness fort. Eleanor Dare was essentially a new mother trying to care for an infant while living in what amounted to a military compound, surrounded by forests, swamps, and the constant possibility of attack. Imagine trying to breastfeed while keeping one eye on the tree line for potential threats. The daily routine of colonial life was brutally demanding in ways that would break most modern people within a week. Every single necessity that we take for granted — food, water, shelter, clothing, medicine, tools, security — had to be produced by hand using primitive techniques and whatever materials they could find or make. There was no running water, no electricity, no refrigeration, no communication with the outside world, no emergency services, no backup plans. Imagine moving to a new neighborhood, except there's no grocery store, no hospital, no police, no fire department, no hardware store, no pharmacy, and your neighbors aren't sure whether they want to welcome you with casseroles or kill you with arrows. That was life at Roanoke Island in 1587, except somehow worse, because at least in a neighborhood you could leave if things got bad. The colonists had to rebuild and improve the fortifications that Ralph Lane's expedition had left behind. The fort needed to provide protection from both human threats and the elements, but it also had to be expanded and modified to accommodate 115 people, including families with children, pregnant women, elderly colonists, and people with different needs than soldiers. It was like renovating a military base to become a small town except with hand tools and no blueprints. Food production was equally critical and infinitely more stressful. The colonists had arrived too late in the season to plant most crops, which meant they would be dependent on their stored supplies, hunting, fishing, and whatever they could trade with local Native Americans for survival. They were essentially trying to feed 115 people using subsistence methods, while also building their community infrastructure and preparing for winter. Every meal was a calculation. How much can we eat today without starving tomorrow? How long will our supplies last? Can we catch enough fish to supplement our stores? Are the Native Americans willing to trade? And if so, what do we have that they want? It was like managing a restaurant where running out of food meant everyone dies. The children added another layer of complexity and anxiety. 9 children, including a newborn infant, needed extra care, protection, and resources that the adult colonists could barely provide for themselves. Parents had to worry not just about their own survival, but about keeping their children fed, healthy, warm, and safe in an environment that was dangerous even for experienced adults. Imagine trying to raise children in a place where every plant might be poisonous, every animal might be dangerous, every day might bring attacks from hostile neighbors, and every mistake could mean death for your family. It was like parenting in a post-apocalyptic survival scenario, except the apocalypse was just their daily reality. Water was a constant life-threatening concern. Roanoke Island had limited freshwater sources, and the colonists had to ensure they had adequate supplies for drinking, cooking, washing, and basic sanitation for 115 people. In an era before understanding of bacteria and waterborne diseases, this was often a matter of deadly trial and error. Bad water could kill you just as quickly as starvation, but they had no way to test water quality beyond taste and smell. The relationship with local Native Americans remained delicate and absolutely crucial to the colony's survival. Monteo's presence helped significantly, but he was just one man trying to bridge 2 completely different cultures with a recent history of violent conflict. The colonists needed to establish trade relationships for food and other necessities, but they also had to avoid the catastrophic mistakes that had doomed Ralph Lane's expedition. Think of it as trying to establish diplomatic relations with your neighbors when the previous residents of your house had robbed and murdered people in the neighborhood. Monteo was essentially trying to convince his people that these new English settlers were different from the previous ones, despite looking exactly the same, speaking the same language, and carrying the same weapons. The psychological isolation was perhaps the most crushing aspect of their situation. These people had absolutely no idea what was happening in England, no way to know if their families back home were alive or dead, no communication with the outside world at all. They were completely cut off from everything and everyone they had known before, with no guarantee that anyone in England even remembered they existed or cared about their fate. As autumn progressed and the days grew shorter, the colonists would have started to seriously worry about John White's return. They had expected him to come back quickly with supplies and reinforcements, but ships kept disappearing over the horizon, with no sign of the relief expedition they desperately needed. Every day without news was another day closer to potential disaster. The food situation would have been a constant source of anxiety that affected every decision. The colonists had to carefully ration their supplies while also trying to establish sustainable food sources for the long term. They were playing a deadly game where the rules kept changing, and the penalty for losing was death by starvation. Hunting and fishing provided some relief, but these activities required skills that many of the colonists simply didn't possess. These were English farmers and craftsmen, not wilderness survival experts. Learning to hunt American animals with unfamiliar behaviors in unfamiliar terrain was like trying to learn a new job, while starving, except the learning curve could be measured in lives lost. The medical situation was particularly grim and terrifying. Colonial medicine was primitive under the best circumstances, and Roanoke Island was far from the best circumstances. Any serious injury or illness could easily become fatal, and the colonists had no way to get help from trained physicians. A broken bone, a difficult childbirth, an infected wound, or a fever could mean death, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Pregnancy and childbirth were especially dangerous and anxiety-inducing. Eleanor Dare had successfully given birth to Virginia, but what about future pregnancies colonial women faced? Enormous risks during childbirth, even when they had access to experienced midwives and medical care. On Roanoke Island, they had neither trained medical help nor the safety net of modern medicine. The children's education and development created additional long-term concerns for parents. How do you raise English children in an environment completely unlike anything in England? What skills would these children need to survive in America that their parents didn't even know how to teach? How could parents prepare their children for a life they themselves were still figuring out how to live? Weather added another unpredictable layer of uncertainty and danger. The colonists had no reliable way to predict storms, no weather forecasting, no warning systems for dangerous conditions. A sudden severe storm could destroy crops, damage buildings, prevent fishing and hunting activities, or cut them off from trade with Native Americans. They were completely at the mercy of forces they couldn't predict or control. As winter approached, the colonists would have been acutely aware that their situation was becoming more precarious by the day. Their stored food supplies were running dangerously low, their ability to hunt and fish was being reduced by cold weather, and there was still no sign of John White's return with the additional supplies they needed for survival. The psychological pressure on the colonists must have been absolutely overwhelming. They were responsible not just for their own survival, but for the survival of their families and their entire community. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death for people they loved. Every mistake could doom everyone. The community dynamics would have been severely tested by the stress, uncertainty, and deteriorating conditions. In a group of 115 people living in close quarters under increasingly dangerous conditions, personality conflicts, leadership disputes, and resource disagreements could easily escalate into serious problems that threatened the entire colony's survival. Despite all these challenges, the colonists persevered through the autumn of 1587. They continued to work on their fortifications, tried to establish productive trade relationships with local Native Americans, carefully rationed their food supplies, and waited with growing desperation for John White's return. They had no way of knowing that events in England were about to make their already desperate situation infinitely worse, or that White's promise to return quickly was being derailed by forces completely beyond his control. They couldn't know that their survival was about to depend on their own resourcefulness and decision-making, with no help coming from England. The colonists of Roanoke were about to learn the hardest lesson in colonial survival. Sometimes hope and determination aren't enough to guarantee survival, and sometimes you have to make impossible choices with incomplete information and no guarantee of success. John White arrived back in England in November 1587, expecting to quickly organize a relief expedition and return to Roanoke Island with the supplies his colonists desperately needed. Instead, he walked straight into a national crisis that would trap him in England for 3 agonizing years, while his daughter, newborn granddaughter, and 113 other colonists faced unknown dangers an ocean away. Imagine rushing home to get help for your family emergency, only to discover that your entire country is about to be invaded by the most powerful military force in the world, and nobody gives a damn about your personal problems. That was John White's situation in late 1587, and it was about to get infinitely worse. Spain was preparing the largest invasion fleet in European history, the Spanish Armada, to conquer England and restore Catholic rule under Spanish dominion. We're talking about 130 ships carrying 30,000 men equipped with the most advanced naval technology of the time, funded by the wealth of an entire empire and commanded by the most experienced naval officers in the world. It was like preparing to fight aliens with superior technology, except the aliens were Spanish, and they were really angry about English privateering. Every English ship, every sailor, every resource that could possibly contribute to national defense was being commandeered by the government. Private colonial ventures were suddenly a luxury that England couldn't afford when the very existence of the English nation was at stake. It was like trying to get permission to go on vacation when your house is surrounded by enemy tanks. White came home asking for ships and supplies just as England was mobilizing for what everyone knew would be a fight for national survival. It was like trying to get a business loan during the economic collapse of 1929. Except instead of economic disaster, it was impending military conquest by a foreign power that wanted to kill or convert every Protestant in England. Queen Elizabeth's government issued emergency orders prohibiting any privately owned ships from leaving English ports without royal permission. The logic was brutally simple. Every vessel might be needed to fight the Spanish fleet or transport troops and supplies for England's defense. Sending ships to America to rescue colonists was simply not a priority when Spanish forces were preparing to invade England itself and potentially end English independence forever. White spent months petitioning anyone who would listen, and the conversations probably went something like this. "Sir, I need ships to rescue 115 English colonists in America." "Are you insane? Spain is about to invade us with the largest fleet ever assembled. We need every ship to defend England. But my daughter and granddaughter are there along with over 100 other people who are probably starving. That's very sad, but we're all going to be dead or enslaved if Spain conquers England. Your colonial problems will have to wait." White begged Queen Elizabeth for ships, appealed to Sir Walter Raleigh for support, tried to organize private investors for a relief expedition. Everyone acknowledged that the Roanoke colonists needed help, but nobody was willing to risk ships and men for a colonial rescue mission when England itself was in mortal danger. The psychological torture that White endured is almost impossible to imagine by modern standards. He knew his daughter was trying to care for an infant in a wilderness fort with dwindling supplies. He knew the colonists were depending on him to return with help. He knew that every day of delay made their situation more desperate and their chances of survival smaller, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. White was like a man watching his house burn down while being told that the fire department was busy dealing with a forest fire that threatened to burn down the entire city. His personal emergency was very real and very urgent, but it was completely overshadowed by a national crisis that affected everyone in England. The guilt must have been absolutely crushing. White had convinced these people to come to America. He had promised to return quickly with supplies. He had left his own daughter and granddaughter based on that promise. Now he was trapped in England while they faced unknown dangers, and there was nothing he could do to help them. In 1588, White managed to secure 2 small ships for a relief expedition, but the voyage was a disaster from the very beginning. The ships were barely seaworthy, understaffed, and inadequately supplied because all the good ships and experienced sailors were needed for England's defense against Spain. They were damaged in storms and attacked by pirates before they ever got close to America. The expedition was forced to return to England, having achieved nothing except proving how impossible it was to reach Roanoke under current conditions. They basically sent a couple of rowboats to cross the Atlantic during wartime, and it went about as well as you'd expect. The failed expedition consumed what little resources White had been able to scrape together and left him even more desperate and helpless than before. Meanwhile, the Spanish Armada crisis reached its climax in the summer of 1588. The massive Spanish fleet sailed up the English Channel toward what everyone expected would be the invasion and conquest of England. English ships, including many that might otherwise have been available for colonial ventures, were pressed into service for what became one of the most famous naval battles in European history. The battle was like something out of a movie, except the special effects were real, and the stakes were the independence of an entire nation. English fire ships, basically floating bombs, were sent into the Spanish fleet. Naval battles raged for days. The Spanish fleet was scattered by storms and English attacks. It was the 16th century equivalent of defeating an alien invasion, and it saved England from foreign conquest. The English victory over the Spanish Armada was celebrated throughout the country as a miraculous deliverance from foreign conquest. Queen Elizabeth became a national hero of mythic proportions. English confidence soared, and suddenly everyone felt that England was destined to become a great naval power that could challenge any enemy. But for John White, the national celebration was just another reminder of how completely his personal crisis had been overshadowed by larger events. While England rejoiced over its victory and planned for future expansion, White's family remained trapped an ocean away with no relief in sight. The victory that saved England might have doomed the Roanoke colonists by consuming all available resources and attention. Even after the Spanish threat passed, colonial ventures remained a low priority for the English government. The victory over Spain had been enormously expensive. The country needed to rebuild its naval forces, pay for the war, and deal with other pressing concerns closer to home. Sending ships to rescue a small group of colonists in America simply wasn't urgent enough to command attention or resources when there were so many other priorities. White spent 1588 and 1589 in a nightmare of bureaucratic frustration and personal anguish. He would get promises of help that led nowhere, assurances of future support that never materialized, meetings with officials who expressed sympathy but offered no actual assistance. Everyone agreed that something should be done about the Roanoke colonists, but nobody was willing to actually do anything concrete to help them. It was like being stuck in a Kafka novel where everyone acknowledges your problem, but the system makes it impossible to solve. Officials would say things like, "Yes, we really should help those colonists," and then do absolutely nothing because other priorities always took precedence. The personal toll on White was devastating and getting worse every day. He was aging rapidly under the stress. His health was declining from the constant anxiety, and his financial resources were completely exhausted from trying to organize failed relief expeditions. He had invested everything, his money, his reputation, his family, in the colonial venture, and now faced the possibility that he had lost not just his investment, but everyone he loved. White was living every parent's nightmare, knowing that your child is in mortal danger, and being completely powerless to help. Worse, he was the one who had left them in that dangerous situation in the first place. The guilt must have been absolutely overwhelming, eating at him every single day. Friends and family tried to console him with the possibility that the colonists had found ways to survive, perhaps by integrating with friendly Native American tribes, or moving to a more suitable location. But White knew better than anyone how precarious their situation had been when he left. and how much they had been depending on his quick return with supplies. As 1589 turned into 1590, White faced the terrible possibility that his 3-year absence had already doomed the colonists he had promised to rescue. Even if he could reach Roanoke Island now, what were the chances that anyone would still be alive after 3 years without the supplies they had expected him to bring? The colonists had been running low on food. When he left, how could they have survived 3 winters in the wilderness? The irony was bitter and cruel. White had left Roanoke to save the colony, but his absence might have condemned it. He had promised to return quickly with help, but forces beyond his control had made that promise impossible to keep. He had done everything right according to the plans they had made, but external circumstances had turned his rescue mission into abandonment. The psychological damage was enormous. White was dealing with survivors' guilt, parental guilt, leaders' guilt, and the horrible uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to the people he loved. Every day brought new anxiety about their fate and new frustration about his inability to help them. Finally, in early 1590, White got his chance, sort of. John Watts, a London merchant, was organizing a privateering expedition to raid Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and make profit from legal piracy. Watts agreed to make a stop at Roanoke Island, not out of any particular concern for the colonists or sympathy for White's situation, but because it was roughly on the way and might provide an opportunity for trade or additional plunder. White joined the expedition as a passenger, not a leader. He was essentially hitchhiking with pirates, hoping they would honor their agreement to stop at Roanoke Island long enough for him to check on the colonists and provide whatever help he could. He had no control over the expedition's priority schedule or decisions. He was completely dependent on the goodwill of men whose primary interest was profit, not rescue. As the ship sailed away from England in March 1590, White must have been filled with a mixture of desperate hope and crushing dread. He was finally returning to Roanoke after 3 years of forced absence, carrying supplies and trade goods for the colonists. But what would he find when he got there? Would his daughter and granddaughter still be alive? Would any of the colonists have survived 3 years without the help he had promised to provide? The voyage took months with stops in the Caribbean for the profitable business of raiding Spanish settlements. Every day of delay was another day his family might be suffering or dying, but White was powerless to speed up the journey. He was a passenger on someone else's ship, dependent on other people's priorities, watching helplessly as time passed. White was about to discover that sometimes the most terrifying thing about a long-delayed homecoming is finally arriving home and learning the truth you've been dreading for years. After 3 agonizing years of forced absence, John White was finally approaching the coast of North Carolina in August 1590. The privateer ships carrying him had spent months raiding Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and White had endured every delay, knowing that each passing day made it less likely he would find his family alive. Picture the mixture of emotions: desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, his daughter and granddaughter had survived 3 years in the wilderness without help; crushing anxiety about what he might find or might not find; guilt about the 3-year delay; terror about the possibilities. After 3 years of wondering, worrying, and blaming himself, he was finally going to get answers. As the familiar coastline came into view on August 15, 1590, White's heart probably stopped when he saw smoke rising from Roanoke Island. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant his family might still be alive. After 3 years of wondering and worrying, after being trapped in England during a national crisis, after failed rescue attempts and bureaucratic nightmares, he was finally going to see his daughter and granddaughter again. White was like a parent coming home after a long business trip, hoping to surprise the kids. Except the trip had lasted 3 years, and he had no idea if anyone would still be there to surprise. The smoke rising from the island was either the best possible sign or the worst possible sign, and there was no way to know which until he got there. But landing on the island proved more difficult and more dangerous than anyone had expected. The weather was rough, the seas were dangerous, and the privateers who had brought him were more interested in getting back to the profitable business of raiding Spanish ships than in carefully investigating a colonial settlement that might not even exist anymore. During the attempt to land, disaster struck before they even reached shore. One of the boats capsized in the violent surf, drowning several crew members and destroying supplies that White had brought for the colonists. It was a grim omen. Before they even set foot on the island, people were dying just trying to get to the place where White hoped to find his family alive. When White finally made it to shore, the eerie silence was immediately noticeable and deeply unsettling. Roanoke Island should have been bustling with the activity of 115 people going about their daily lives. There should have been voices calling out greetings, children playing sounds of work and conversation. the normal noise of a functioning community. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of wind and waves. No human voices, no children playing, no sounds of work or daily life. The island felt abandoned, empty, dead. The island looked like a movie set after everyone had gone home for the day, except this wasn't a movie, and these were real people who had trusted him to come back and save them. White made his way toward where the fort and settlement should have been, his anxiety growing with every step. The paths that should have been well worn from daily use were overgrown with vegetation. The clearings that should have been maintained for crops and buildings were reverting to forest. Nature was already reclaiming the spaces where his family had lived. When he reached the site of the fort, White found something that was both deeply relieving and absolutely terrifying. The palisade, the wooden fence that had surrounded the settlement for protection, had been carefully dismantled. This wasn't the result of attack or destruction. Someone had methodically taken apart the fortifications board by post by post. The houses inside the fort had been similarly dismantled with systematic care. The colonists had carefully taken apart their buildings, presumably to move the materials elsewhere. Personal possessions had been removed or deliberately buried. Heavy items like cannons had been buried in the sand to prevent rust and damage from weather. It looked like the colonists had held the world's most thorough garage sale and then disappeared into thin air. This was simultaneously the best possible news and the most terrifying possible news. Best news because there were no signs of violence, no evidence of attack or massacre, no bodies or bones scattered around the settlement. The systematic dismantling suggested the colonists had left voluntarily and had time to pack their belongings carefully and make rational decisions about their departure. Terrifying news because 115 people had simply vanished without leaving any clear indication of where they had gone, why they had left, or whether they were still alive. It was like finding your house completely empty with a note that just said "gone" with no forwarding address. As White searched through the abandoned settlement with growing desperation, he found evidence of careful preparation rather than hasty evacuation. The colonists had taken time to bury heavy items they couldn't carry, remove anything valuable or useful, and systematically dismantle structures they had spent months building. This wasn't panic, this was planning. But where had they gone? And why hadn't they left a clearer message about their destination and situation? Then White found it, and his heart probably stopped, carved into a wooden post at the entrance to the abandoned fort. The word Croatoan in clear, deliberate letters. This was both exactly what White had hoped to find and nowhere near enough information to ease his anxiety. Before leaving in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a communication system for staying in touch across the ocean and years. If the colonists had to move to a different location for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination into a prominent tree or post. If they were in danger or under attack, they would carve a cross above the location name as a distress signal. Croatoan was carved clearly into the post, but there was no cross above it. According to their agreed-upon system, this meant the colonists had moved to Croatoan Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, voluntarily, not under duress or attack. They had followed the plan exactly as they had discussed. Croatoan was like finding a sticky note on your refrigerator that said "gone fishing," except your entire family had written it and disappeared for 3 years without any other communication. Croatoan Island was about 50 miles south of Roanoke Island and was the home of Manteo's tribe, the Native Americans, who had been most consistently friendly to the English colonists. If the colonists had relocated there, it would make perfect sense strategically. Croatoan had a better harbor for ships, more abundant food sources from fishing and farming freshwater sources, and a population that was already allied with the English and had personal relationships with the colonists. White felt a surge of hope mixed with desperate relief. The carved message suggested that his family and the other colonists were alive and had found a safe refuge with friendly Native Americans. There was no sign of violence, disease, or forced evacuation. The colonists had apparently made a rational, planned decision to relocate to a better location with better resources and better security. But White's relief was immediately tempered by a practical problem that was about to become a nightmare, reaching Croatoan Island to confirm this hopeful theory and reunite with his family. The privateers who had brought him to Roanoke were increasingly eager to continue their profitable raiding activities and weren't particularly interested in conducting a thorough search for missing colonists who might or might not still be alive. Moreover, the weather was turning dangerous with the unpredictability that made the Outer Banks notorious among sailors. Late summer on the North Carolina coast could produce severe storms with little warning, and the shallow waters around the barrier islands made navigation treacherous even under good conditions. Ships could be wrecked, crews could be killed, and expeditions could be lost entirely. White pleaded desperately with the ship captains to sail south to Croatoan Island so he could verify that the colonists were there provide them with the supplies he had brought, and finally reunite with his daughter and granddaughter after 3 years of separation. After being trapped in England during a national crisis after failed rescue attempts after 3 years of guilt and anxiety, he was so close to being reunited with his family that the possibility of leaving without confirming their fate was absolutely unbearable. The captains agreed to attempt the voyage to Croatoan, but they were clearly reluctant and probably only agreed because they didn't want to deal with White's emotional breakdown if they refused. But nature and the notorious Outer Banks weather had other plans for this reunion. A severe storm arose before the ships could weigh anchor properly, and the vessels were driven out to sea by powerful winds and dangerous waves that threatened to destroy the ships entirely. White stood on deck watching helplessly as the coast of North Carolina disappeared, knowing that his family might be just 50 miles away but completely unable to reach them. White was literally being dragged away from the only clue to his family's fate by forces completely beyond his control. The storm was so severe and dangerous that the ship's anchors broke under the strain, and they were forced far out to sea for their own survival. For hours that must have felt like years, White stood on deck watching the coast of North Carolina disappear into the distance, knowing that his daughter and granddaughter might be just 50 miles away, but completely unable to reach them. The irony was cruel beyond description. After 3 years of being prevented from returning to America by a national crisis, after finally making the voyage across the Atlantic, after finding evidence that his family might still be alive, he was being prevented from reaching them by a storm that he couldn't control and ships that weren't under his command. When the storm finally passed and the immediate danger was over, the ship captains assessed the damage and declared that attempting to return to the dangerous coast would be too risky for the ship's crews and cargo. The ships had been damaged by the storm, some anchors were lost, and the weather remained unpredictable and threatening. The privateering season was already late, and they needed to begin the return voyage to England before winter made Atlantic crossing even more hazardous and potentially fatal. White was faced with an impossible choice that no parent should ever have to make: abandon his search for the colonists and return to England with the privateers, or demand that they take him back to the dangerous coast and risk everyone's lives in another attempt to reach Croatoan Island in deteriorating weather conditions. The heartbreaking decision was essentially made for him. The ship captains responsible for their crews, their ships, and their profitable cargo refused to risk another approach to the dangerous coast. White was essentially being kidnapped away from his family by men who had their own priorities, responsibilities, and financial interests that didn't include colonial rescue missions. As the ships turned toward England and began the long voyage home, White took one last desperate look at the American coast and wrote in his journal what would become one of the most haunting sentences in American history: "I greatly joyed that I had safely found a token of their safe being at Croatoan." Despite his bitter disappointment at being unable to reach them, despite 3 years of forced separation, despite the cruel irony of being dragged away just when reunion seemed possible, White chose to interpret the carved message optimistically. His family was alive. They had found safety with friendly Native Americans, and they were presumably living peacefully on Croatoan Island, waiting for his return. But White would never return to America to verify this hopeful interpretation. The aging colonists made the long voyage back to England, carrying supplies that would never reach their intended recipients, carrying questions that would never be answered, carrying hope that would never be confirmed or destroyed. White spent his remaining years in Ireland, never again attempting to reach America or learn the fate of his daughter and granddaughter. Historical records suggest he died around 1593, roughly 3 years after his return from his final, failed attempt to reach Roanoke. He carried to his grave the hope that his family had survived and the terrible uncertainty of never knowing for sure what had happened to them. The word Croatoan, carved into that wooden post, remains one of the most famous and mysterious clues in American history. But like so many clues in historical mysteries, it raised as many questions as it answered, and probably more. Did the colonists really go to Croatoan Island? Did they survive there? Did they integrate successfully with Manteo's tribe? Did they try to sail back to England on their own when White didn't return? Did they move somewhere else entirely? Did they all survive? Or did some die along the way? Did Virginia Dare grow up as a Native American? Did any of them live to see other English colonists arrive in America? John White died without answers to any of these questions. The man who had founded the Lost Colony, been forced to abandon it during a national crisis, and spent 3 years trying desperately to return to save the people he loved, would never learn whether his sacrifice had been worthwhile, whether his absence had doomed them, or whether his optimistic interpretation of their fate had been justified. The carved word Croatoan would become one of the most analyzed, theorized, debated, and obsessed over clues in American history. But for John White, it was simply the last message from a family he would never see again, a clue that promised hope, but delivered only more uncertainty, and a single word that would haunt him for the rest of his life. For over 4 centuries, historians, archaeologists, amateur detectives, conspiracy theorists, and true crime enthusiasts have been trying to solve the mystery of what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. It's like playing the world's most frustrating game of Clue, except the crime scene is 400 years old. Most of the evidence has been destroyed by time and weather. The witnesses are all dead, and the stakes are understanding what happened to 115 real people, including the first English child born in America. The theories range from perfectly logical to completely insane, with most falling somewhere in between. The most straightforward interpretation of the evidence is that the colonists did exactly what their carved message suggested. They packed up their entire lives and moved to Croatoan Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, about 50 miles south of Roanoke. This theory makes perfect sense for multiple reasons that would be obvious to anyone trying to survive in 1587. Croatoan was the home of Manteo's tribe, who had been consistently friendly to the English throughout all their previous encounters. The island had significantly better natural resources than Roanoke, including freshwater sources, abundant fishing opportunities, more fertile soil for crops, and better protection from storms. Most importantly, the colonists had a pre-existing relationship with the Croatoan people through Manteo, and could reasonably expect to be welcomed there instead of killed on sight. Think of it as moving in with your only friends in the neighborhood after your original apartment became unlivable and dangerous. When you're facing starvation, isolation, and potential attack, going to stay with people who actually like you seems like common sense. Archaeological evidence on Hatteras Island has turned up numerous European artifacts dating to the late 16th century that could support this theory. Archaeologists have found copper pieces that appear to be from English sources, metal objects that might be fragments of English tools, or weapons, glass beads that were commonly used for trade with Native Americans, and other items that suggest sustained European presence during exactly the right time period. The most exciting discovery was a ring bearing what appears to be the Kendall family crest. The Kendalls were among the Roanoke colonists, so finding their family ring on Hatteras Island would be strong evidence that at least some colonists made it there and lived there long enough to lose personal possessions in the archaeological record. But here's where modern science meets the frustrating reality of historical investigation, proving that these artifacts came specifically from the Roanoke colonists rather than from other sources of European contact is nearly impossible. European trade goods were circulating throughout Native American communities via complex trade networks that covered thousands of miles and operated for decades. It's like finding a McDonald's wrapper in Central Park and trying to prove which specific McDonald's it came from, who bought the food when they dropped it, and whether they were tourists or locals. The evidence is tantalizing, but not definitive. Later European explorers and colonists reported encounters with Native Americans who had gray eyes, spoke English words, displayed other European physical characteristics, or possessed European-made objects. These reports came from various locations throughout coastal North Carolina and Virginia over several decades, suggesting that Europeans had integrated with local tribes, and their children inherited mixed ancestry. Captain John Smith, who helped establish Jamestown in 1607, reported that Powhatan Indians told him about white people living among tribes in the interior who had been killed in conflicts shortly before his arrival. If these reports were accurate and referred to Roanoke colonists, it would suggest they had survived for about 20 years before meeting violent ends. But again, these reports are difficult to verify and could have multiple explanations. European sailors had been shipwrecked along the coast for decades before Roanoke. Spanish explorers had been in the region since the early 1500s. Any European features in Native American populations could have come from numerous sources other than the specific group of Roanoke colonists. A broader and more realistic version of the Croatoan theory suggests that the colonists didn't just move to one specific island, but dispersed among multiple friendly Native American communities throughout the region. This would explain why later Europeans reported encounters with English-speaking natives or European-looking individuals across a wide geographic area, rather than finding one intact English community. This theory assumes that the colonists, faced with the brutal reality that England had apparently abandoned them to die in the wilderness, made the rational decision to integrate with local populations that could provide for their survival. Rather than maintaining their separate English identity and risking starvation or death, they chose to become Americans in the most literal sense, joining the people who were already successfully living in America. Think of it as the ultimate witness protection program, except instead of hiding from criminals, they were adapting to survive in a completely different world with completely different rules. The integration theory would explain several puzzling aspects of the mystery that other theories can't address. It would account for the orderly dismantling of the fort and the careful removal of possessions people preparing to join existing communities wouldn't need their European-style buildings, but would want to take useful tools, weapons, and materials with them to their new lives. It would also explain why no large group of Europeans was ever found living independently as a distinct English community. If the colonists split up among multiple native communities, they would be absorbed into existing populations rather than maintaining a separate settlement that later explorers could easily locate and identify. The integration theory is actually the most optimistic possible outcome for the colonists. Instead of dying horribly from disease, starvation, or violence, they successfully adapted to a new way of life, contributed their skills to existing communities, and their children grew up as Americans with mixed cultural heritage. Modern DNA studies have found European genetic markers in some Eastern Native American populations, but proving a specific connection to the Roanoke colonists remains frustratingly elusive. Genetic mixing could have resulted from many different sources: shipwrecked sailors, Spanish explorers, later English colonists, French traders, or any number of other European contacts over several centuries. It's like trying to identify a specific raindrop in a river after it's been flowing for 400 years. Remember that the Roanoke colonists were originally supposed to settle in the Chesapeake Bay area, but were dumped at Roanoke Island by their unhelpful ship captain, who was more interested in piracy than passenger service. Some theories suggest that the colonists eventually tried to reach their original destination, either by land or by building boats. The Chesapeake Bay area had several major advantages over Roanoke Island that would have been obvious to the colonists: much better harbors for supply ships from England, more fertile land for farming reliable freshwater sources, and a location that would be easier for relief expeditions to find. If the colonists realized that their situation at Roanoke was unsustainable, and John White wasn't coming back anytime soon, attempting to reach the Chesapeake would be a logical survival decision. The land route would have been dangerous, but not impossible. The colonists would have had to travel roughly 200 miles through unfamiliar territory, deal with multiple Native American tribes of unknown disposition, cross rivers and swamps, and transport their possessions and children through wilderness. But people desperate enough might attempt it, especially if they believed their survival depended on reaching a better location. Alternatively, the colonists might have attempted to build or acquire boats capable of coastal travel. With their tools and the shipbuilding knowledge that some colonists possessed, they might have been able to construct vessels suitable for traveling along the coast to the Chesapeake Bay. Captain John Smith's reports about white people living among Powhatan tribes could support this theory. If Roanoke colonists had made it to the Chesapeake area, but were killed in the complex political conflicts that Smith encountered when Jamestown was established, it would explain why no intact English community was found, but why there were reports of Europeans living with Native Americans. The timing would be roughly correct, about 20 years after the colonists disappeared from Roanoke, and the political situation in the Chesapeake was volatile enough that conflicts resulting in deaths would be entirely plausible. Not all theories about the lost colony assume the colonists survived their ordeal. Several scenarios propose that the colonists met with disaster shortly after John White's departure, explaining why they were never found and why no definitive trace of their fate has ever been discovered. Disease could have wiped out the entire population in a matter of weeks or months. Colonial settlements were extremely vulnerable to epidemics, especially when they were isolated from medical help and supplies. A severe outbreak of smallpox, influenza plague, or any number of other diseases could have killed most or all of the colonists, with any survivors too weak to maintain the settlement or seek help. Starvation was another very real possibility that the colonists faced every day. They were dependent on stored supplies that were running low, their ability to hunt and fish in unfamiliar territory, and trade with Native Americans who had their own food security concerns. A harsh winter crop failure, breakdown in trade relationships, or simple inability to find adequate food could have led to slow death by famine. Natural disasters could have forced the colonists to abandon Roanoke Island in desperation. Severe hurricanes regularly devastated the Outer Banks, and the colonists would have been particularly vulnerable to storms, floods, or other weather-related catastrophes that could destroy their food supplies, shelter, and equipment. Warfare with hostile Native American groups could have resulted in the destruction of the colony. If relations with local tribes broke down completely, perhaps due to cultural misunderstandings, resource competition, or the legacy of Ralph Lane's violent approach, the colonists could have been attacked and killed, or driven away from the island. But here's the major problem. With all disaster theories, they don't explain the orderly dismantling of the settlement or the careful removal of possessions that John White discovered. If the colonists had died from disease, starvation, or natural disaster, White should have found bodies, graves, personal possessions left behind, or at least evidence of hasty evacuation and panic. Instead, he found evidence of careful, systematic preparation for departure. This suggests that whatever happened to the colonists, they had time to plan and organize their response, rather than falling victim to sudden catastrophe that left them no time to react. Perhaps the most realistic and practical theory is that the colonists didn't all go to the same place, or make the same decisions about their survival. Faced with an impossible situation, no supplies from England, dwindling resources, and 115 people to keep alive through multiple winters, they might have made the rational decision to split into smaller groups with better chances of individual survival. Some colonists might have gone to Croatoan Island, with Monteo's tribe using their existing relationship for safety and support. Others might have tried to reach the Chesapeake Bay area by land or water, seeking the better location they were originally supposed to settle. Still others might have moved inland to join different Native American communities that offered opportunities for integration and survival. A few desperate souls might have even attempted to build boats and sail back to England on their own when it became clear that John White wasn't returning as promised. This would have been extremely dangerous, but people facing certain death might attempt even unlikely survival strategies. This would explain why later European explorers found traces of English presence in multiple locations, but never discovered a large intact group of Roanoke survivors living together as a community. It would also explain why the evidence is so scattered, inconclusive, and open to multiple interpretations, because the colonists themselves scattered across a wide geographic area and had different fates. Think of it like a group of friends deciding to split up at the mall when they can't agree on where to go next, except the stakes were life and death for entire families, and the mall was the entire eastern seaboard of North America in 1587. Some theories suggest that the English government knew what happened to the Roanoke colonists, but deliberately covered up the truth for political reasons that seemed important at the time. Maybe the colonists were killed in conflicts with Spanish forces, and England didn't want to provoke a larger war during a period of international tension. Maybe they were captured by Spanish agents and taken to Spanish colonies as prisoners or slaves. Or perhaps the colonists successfully established a settlement somewhere else, but the English government decided to keep the location secret to prevent Spanish interference or to maintain strategic advantages in future colonial ventures. The cover-up theory would explain why so many records related to the Roanoke colony seem to have been lost or destroyed over the centuries, and why later English colonial ventures seem to deliberately avoid the areas where the colonists might logically have gone. But conspiracy theories about government cover-ups suffer from the same problem as most conspiracy theories. They require a level of coordination, secrecy, and competence that governments rarely demonstrate, especially over periods of decades or centuries. Keeping secrets for 400 plus years is really hard, especially when multiple people are involved, and there's no compelling reason to maintain secrecy after the original political concerns become irrelevant. Recent archaeological and scientific investigations have provided new evidence and eliminated some possibilities, but they haven't definitively solved the mystery or provided the smoking gun that would finally answer the question of what happened to the 115 colonists. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed buried structures on Roanoke Island that might date to the colonial period. Underwater archaeology has turned up artifacts in the sounds around the Outer Banks that could be related to the Lost Colony. DNA analysis has found European genetic markers in some Native American populations that might indicate intermarriage with English colonists, but 400 years is a long time for evidence to survive, and the Outer Banks are particularly hostile to archaeological preservation. Saltwater corrodes, metal storms destroy organic materials, shifting sands bury and uncover artifacts randomly, and rising sea levels have changed the entire landscape since the 16th century. Modern investigations are like trying to solve a murder case where the crime scene has been remodeled. Flooded, struck by hurricanes, and built over multiple times across 4 centuries, the evidence that remains is fragmentary, contaminated by later events, and open to multiple interpretations. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. The evidence is too fragmentary, too contaminated by time and later events, and too open to multiple interpretations to support definitive conclusions about the fate of 115 specific people who disappeared over 400 years ago. But that uncertainty is part of what makes the mystery so compelling and enduring. In a world where we can track our food deliveries in real time and locate our lost phones using satellite technology, the idea that 115 people could simply vanish and stay vanished for over 4 centuries is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The Lost Colony reminds us that history is full of questions without answers, and sometimes the mystery itself is more interesting and meaningful than any solution could ever be. If you think the mystery of the Lost Colony would be easy to solve with modern technology, you're both absolutely right and frustratingly wrong. Today's archaeological techniques, scientific analysis methods, and research capabilities would have made solving this mystery much simpler if we could apply them in 1590 when the trail was fresh. But using 21st century science to investigate a 400-year-old mystery is like trying to perform heart surgery with the most advanced medical equipment in the world on a patient who's been dead for 4 centuries. Still, modern investigators haven't given up hope. In fact, the Lost Colony has become one of the most scientifically investigated historical mysteries in America, attracting archaeologists, geneticists, historians, forensic experts, and even citizen scientists who are applying cutting-edge techniques to this centuries-old puzzle with the determination of detectives working a fresh case. Archaeologists working on Roanoke-related sites today are basically CSI investigators working the world's oldest and most famous cold case. They use ground-penetrating radar to detect buried structures without disturbing the soil above them, like medical X-rays for the Earth. They employ metal detectors systematically to locate artifacts that might have been missed by previous searches or revealed by centuries of erosion. They use sophisticated radiocarbon dating techniques to determine the age of organic materials with remarkable precision, often accurate to within a few decades. The Lost Colony Center for Science and Research, established specifically to coordinate modern investigations into the mystery, has turned the search for answers into a serious professional scientific research project. They maintain comprehensive databases of artifacts, coordinate multiple excavation sites, use citizen scientists and volunteers to expand their research capabilities, and apply modern project management techniques to what was once just amateur treasure hunting. Think of it as crowdsourcing a 400-year-old missing persons case, except with PhD-level expertise and million-dollar equipment instead of amateur speculation and metal detectors. One of the most significant modern developments has been the use of LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, to create incredibly detailed topographical maps of Roanoke Island and the surrounding area. LiDAR can penetrate vegetation and reveal landscape features that aren't visible to the naked eye, including the foundations of buildings, old roads, earthworks, and other modifications to the natural landscape that might date to the colonial period. These digital maps have revealed something absolutely crucial. The landscape of Roanoke Island looked dramatically different in the 16th century than it does today. Centuries of erosion, major storms, and rising sea levels have altered the coastline so significantly that areas which are now underwater might have been dry land when the colonists lived there. Understanding the historical geography is essential to interpreting archaeological finds and planning new excavations in the right locations. Computer modeling allows researchers to recreate the 16th century environment in extraordinary detail. They can simulate weather patterns, tidal flows, vegetation types, animal populations, and resource availability to better understand the challenges the colonists would have faced and the opportunities that would have been available to them for survival. It's like creating a historically accurate video game environment, except instead of entertainment, the goal is understanding how real people lived and died 400 years ago. The most promising recent investigations have focused on Hatteras Island, the modern name for Croatoan Island, where the carved message suggested the colonists had relocated. Systematic archaeological excavations there have revealed Native American sites that contain European artifacts dating to the late 16th century, exactly when the Roanoke colonists would have been there if they followed their carved message. These finds include pieces of copper that could be from English sources, metal objects that might be fragments of English tools or weapons, glass beads that were commonly used for trade between Europeans and Native Americans, pottery fragments that show European influence on Native American craftsmanship, and other items that suggest sustained contact between Europeans and the Croatoan people during exactly the relevant time period. The most exciting discovery was what appeared to be a ring bearing the Kendall family crest. The Kendalls were documented among the Roanoke colonists, so finding their family ring on Hatteras Island would be extremely strong evidence that at least some colonists made it there and lived there long enough to lose personal possessions that ended up in the archaeological record. But here's where modern science meets the frustrating reality of historical investigation, proving that these artifacts came specifically from the Roanoke colonists rather than from other sources of European contact is nearly impossible with current technology. European trade goods were circulating throughout Native American communities via complex trade networks that covered thousands of miles and operated for decades before and after the Roanoke colony. It's like finding a Starbucks cup in Central Park and trying to prove which specific Starbucks it came from, who bought the coffee when they dropped the cup, whether they were a tourist or a local, and what they were doing in the park. The evidence is tantalizing and suggestive, but not definitively conclusive. Radiocarbon dating can tell us that organic materials associated with these artifacts date to roughly the right time period, but the margins of error are often several decades. An artifact that dates to late 16th century could be from 1587, when the colonists disappeared, or it could be from 1560 when Spanish explorers were active in the area, or from 1605 when other English expeditions were operating along the coast. DNA analysis has opened another fascinating avenue of investigation that didn't exist even a few decades ago. Researchers have tested Native American populations throughout the region, looking for European genetic markers that might indicate intermarriage between English colonists and local tribes. Some studies have found European DNA in eastern Native American populations, but proving a specific connection to the Roanoke colonists is extraordinarily difficult. Genetic mixing could have resulted from many different sources over several centuries, shipwrecked sailors from any number of vessels, Spanish explorers who were active in the region for over a century later, English colonists from various settlements, French traders, or any number of other European contacts. It's like trying to identify a specific raindrop in a river after it's been flowing and mixing for 400 years. One of the most intriguing modern discoveries came from a completely unexpected source: hidden details in John White's own historical maps that were invisible until modern imaging technology revealed them. When researchers used advanced X-ray analysis to examine White's map of the Virginia coast, they discovered symbols that had been covered by patches pasted onto the original map. Under these patches, digital analysis revealed the image of a small fort symbol at a location on the mainland west of Roanoke Island. This hidden symbol might indicate a secret location where the colonists planned to establish an alternate settlement, a backup plan that White didn't want to make public, or it might just be an artist's correction that White decided to cover up for aesthetic reasons. It's like finding Easter eggs hidden in a 400-year-old video game, except the Easter eggs might contain crucial clues to what happened to your family, or they might just be mistakes that the artist wanted to hide. Climate data reconstruction has provided crucial context for understanding the enormous challenges the colonists faced that previous investigators didn't fully appreciate. Tree ring analysis from ancient trees throughout the region shows that 1587-1589 was one of the worst drought periods in 800 years, creating conditions that would have made farming extremely difficult and put enormous pressure on food supplies for everyone in the region. This means that not only were the English colonists struggling with food production in unfamiliar soil with unfamiliar crops, but their Native American neighbors were also dealing with crop failures and resource scarcity that would have made them less able or willing to share food with the English settlers. Understanding that the colonists were trying to survive during what was essentially a regional climate disaster helps explain why their situation became so desperate so quickly, and why they might have been forced to make radical decisions about relocation or integration with other communities that had better access to food and water. Modern investigations have also benefited tremendously from the democratization of historical research through citizen science. Amateur researchers, metal detector enthusiasts, and local historians contribute significantly to the search for evidence by volunteering their time, expertise, and resources. Some of the most significant artifact discoveries have been made by people with metal detectors who were donating their time to help solve the mystery. The internet has revolutionized historical research in ways that would have been impossible even a few decades ago. Amateur researchers can access digitized historical documents, share theories and evidence, instantly coordinate investigations across vast distances, and contribute to archaeological projects from anywhere in the world. It's like having thousands of volunteer detectives working on the same cold case, each bringing different skills, perspectives, and resources to the investigation. The collective intelligence and effort far exceed what any individual researcher or institution could accomplish alone. But modern technology also reveals the harsh limitations of what we can realistically learn from 400-year-old evidence in one of the most hostile environments for archaeological preservation in North America. The Outer Banks are particularly brutal to historical artifacts due to saltwater corrosion, violent storms, shifting sands, and rising sea levels that have destroyed or buried most organic materials from the 16th century. Metal objects corrode rapidly in the saltwater environment, becoming unrecognizable fragments. Wood rots completely or is destroyed by hurricanes and storms. Clothing, documents, leather goods, and other organic materials decompose entirely, leaving no trace. Even pottery and other ceramic objects are broken into tiny pieces and scattered by centuries of weather and human activity. Time is the ultimate evidence destroyer, and investigators are working with fragments of what might once have been clear, definitive evidence of the colonists' fate. Advanced underwater archaeology has used sophisticated sonar and metal detection equipment to search the sounds and waters around the Outer Banks for evidence of boats or ships that might have been used by colonists attempting to leave the area or travel to other locations. Side-scan sonar and underwater metal detectors have found numerous shipwrecks dating to various time periods, but determining which ones might be related to the Lost Colony is virtually impossible. The waters around the Outer Banks have been claiming ships for centuries, creating an underwater graveyard of incredible complexity. Spanish vessels, English ships, pirates, merchants, naval vessels from various wars, fishing boats, and pleasure craft have all been wrecked in these dangerous waters. Identifying specific wrecks from specific time periods requires enormous amounts of detective work and often produces inconclusive results. Despite all these technological advances and scientific techniques, despite decades of professional investigation and millions of dollars in research funding, the mystery of the Lost Colony remains fundamentally unsolved. Modern investigations have provided tantalizing clues, eliminated some impossible theories, and added sophisticated scientific rigor to the search for answers, but they haven't produced the definitive evidence that would finally close the case. In some ways, this makes the mystery even more compelling and unsettling. We live in an age where we expect technology to provide answers to virtually any question we can ask. The idea that a historical puzzle could resist solution, despite decades of scientific investigation using the most advanced techniques available, reminds us that some questions might never be answered, no matter how sophisticated our tools become. The Lost Colony continues to attract new generations of researchers, each hoping that the next excavation, the next DNA test, the next technological breakthrough, or the next creative approach will finally reveal the truth about America's oldest and most persistent unsolved mystery. But maybe the enduring mystery is more valuable than any solution could ever be, reminding us that the past still holds secrets, and that human experience contains elements that can't be fully explained or controlled, even with all our modern knowledge and technology. The Lost Colony of Roanoke has evolved far beyond just a historical mystery. It's become America's foundational ghost story, a cultural touchstone that represents our deepest national anxieties about disappearance, abandonment, and the terrifying fragility of civilization. For over 400 years, each generation has rediscovered the mystery and found new ways to interpret it, turning a tragic historical event into a permanent fixture of American mythology that reveals as much about us as it does about the colonists. In the early days of American history, when the country was still figuring out its identity and trying to distinguish itself from European traditions, the story of Roanoke served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of colonial expansion and the vulnerability of civilization in the face of an untamed wilderness. If an entire English settlement could simply vanish without a trace, what did that say about the viability of European civilization in the New World? The mystery became a symbol of colonial vulnerability and a warning about the risks of venturing too far from established support systems. It was proof that America was still a dangerous frontier, where entire communities could disappear into the unknown, reminding everyone that survival was never guaranteed, and civilization was more fragile than most people wanted to admit. Think of it as America's first urban legend, except instead of being made up to scare teenagers around campfires, it was a real historical disaster that naturally terrified people because it actually happened to real families who had made the same kinds of hopes and sacrifices that later colonists were making. By the 19th century, as America became more confident and romanticized, its own origins, writers, and artists had begun transforming the Lost Colony story into something more palatable and inspiring. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, became a folk hero representing innocence, hope, and the promise of the New World. Romantic poets and storytellers created elaborate myths about her fate, including the famous legend of the White Doe of Roanoke. According to this legend, Virginia Dare had been transformed into a beautiful white deer by friendly Native American magic, allowing her to live forever in the American wilderness as a symbol of the connection between European civilization and the natural world. It was a story that satisfied Victorian Americans' desire for magical thinking and happy endings, while avoiding the harsh reality that a baby had probably died horribly along with her entire community. Victorian Americans loved this kind of romantic mythology because it allowed them to feel good about their colonial heritage, without confronting the brutal realities of what colonization actually involved. They took a story about real people facing probable death and starvation and turned it into a fairy tale about magical transformation and noble sacrifice. It was historical fan fiction written by people who preferred their colonial history with more fantasy and less actual suffering. The romanticization of Virginia Dare also reflected 19th century American anxieties about national identity and origins. As the country expanded westward and immigration increased dramatically, there was a growing desire to establish a distinctly American mythology that wasn't borrowed from European traditions or dependent on European approval. Virginia Dare provided exactly that. She was literally the first American born in the New World, representing a pure American identity that predated all the complications of later immigration, slavery, and territorial expansion. She was America before America became problematic, a symbol of innocence and possibility that could be celebrated without moral ambiguity. The problem with turning real people into mythological figures is that it tends to erase their actual humanity and replace it with whatever symbolism seems convenient at the time. Virginia Dare, the historical person, a real baby who disappeared along with her family, became less important than Virginia Dare, the symbol representing whatever Americans wanted to believe about themselves and their origins. As American tourism developed in the 20th century, and historical sites became major attractions, the Lost Colony became the centerpiece of a growing industry in the Outer Banks region of North Carolina. Roanoke Island marketed itself aggressively as the birthplace of America, competing with other colonial sites like Jamestown and Plymouth for tourist dollars and historical significance. This tourism focus led to the creation of The Lost Colony, an outdoor drama that has been performed on Roanoke Island every summer since 1937, making it the second longest-running outdoor drama in the United States. The play has been seen by millions of visitors over the decades, making it many Americans' primary exposure to the Lost Colony story. The outdoor drama presents a heavily dramatized interpretation of the colonists' experiences, complete with Native American characters, romantic subplots, musical numbers, and a mysterious ending that leaves audiences wondering about the colonists' fate, while feeling entertained rather than disturbed by the historical tragedy. The play is essentially historical entertainment. It's based on real events but transforms them into theatrical spectacle for maximum emotional impact and audience satisfaction. It's like watching a movie based on a true story, where the true story has been heavily edited for dramatic effect and audience comfort. The outdoor drama has had enormous influence on how Americans understand the Lost Colony story, often becoming their primary source of information about the historical events. For many visitors, the theatrical interpretation shapes their understanding more than historical evidence, which means millions of Americans know the story through the lens of entertainment rather than historical accuracy. This creates a fascinating feedback loop where popular culture influences public understanding, which influences tourism, which influences funding for research, which influences what aspects of the mystery get investigated and publicized. The entertainment version of the story becomes more real in public consciousness than the historical version. Modern media has found endless fascination with the Roanoke mystery, treating it as America's most compelling unsolved case. The History Channel has produced multiple documentaries examining different theories about the colonists' fate, each promising to finally solve the mystery using the latest scientific techniques or newly discovered evidence. American Horror Story Roanoke used the mystery as the foundation for a supernatural horror story that introduced the Lost Colony to a completely new generation of Americans who might never have encountered it through traditional historical education. The show took creative liberties that would make historians cringe, but it also sparked renewed interest in the actual historical mystery. YouTube mystery channels with millions of subscribers regularly feature the Lost Colony in videos about unsolved historical cases, often presenting theories that range from scientifically plausible to completely insane. These videos reach audiences that traditional historical documentaries never could, spreading awareness of the mystery to people who might not otherwise care about 16th century colonial history. Each new generation discovers the mystery and applies contemporary cultural anxieties to their interpretation of it. During the Cold War, some theories suggested the colonists had been captured by enemy agents working for hostile foreign powers. During the UFO craze of the 1950s and 60s, some people seriously proposed alien abduction as a possible explanation for the disappearance. In our current era of conspiracy theories and government distrust, cover-up scenarios have become more popular, with some people suggesting that the government knows what happened, but is hiding the truth for reasons that are never quite explained, but always seem sinister. The mystery serves as a kind of historical Rorschach test. People see in it whatever reflects their own fears, preoccupations, and cultural anxieties. The Lost Colony becomes a blank canvas onto which each generation projects its own concerns about disappearance, abandonment, government secrecy, and the fragility of civilization. North Carolina has made the Lost Colony mystery a central part of its state identity and tourism industry, understanding that the unsolved mystery is actually more valuable economically than any definitive answer could ever be. Historical markers throughout the Outer Banks region reference the mystery. Museums feature extensive exhibits about the colonists, and guided tours take visitors to sites associated with the story. The state has invested heavily in archaeological research and historical preservation related to the Lost Colony, partly out of genuine historical interest, but also because the mystery attracts tourists and generates significant economic activity. A 400-year-old disappearance has become a modern economic engine that supports entire communities. Educational systems throughout America have embraced the Lost Colony as an ideal way to teach students about colonial history, historical research methods, and the challenges of interpreting incomplete evidence. The mystery appears in textbooks, classroom curricula, and educational programs from elementary school through university level. For many American students, the Lost Colony is their first exposure to the idea that history contains unsolved mysteries and unanswered questions. It teaches them that the past isn't always a neat story with clear beginnings, middles, and satisfying endings. Sometimes history is messy, incomplete, and frustrating, just like real life. The digital age has given the Lost Colony mystery explosive new life and reached audiences that previous generations of researchers could never have imagined. Social media platforms buzz with discussions of different theories, debate about evidence, and speculation about new discoveries. Online communities share research, coordinate amateur investigations, and propose solutions that range from brilliant to bizarre. Virtual reality experiences now allow people to visit detailed recreations of the 1587 settlement and explore the historical site as it might have appeared to the colonists. These immersive experiences bring the mystery to life in ways that books and documentaries never could, allowing people to experience the isolation and vulnerability that the colonists would have felt. Podcasts dedicated to historical mysteries regularly feature multi-episode series about Roanoke, diving deep into the evidence and theories with the kind of detailed analysis that appeals to true crime enthusiasts and history buffs alike. The mystery has found new audiences who might never visit North Carolina, but are absolutely fascinated by the unsolved puzzle. The internet has democratized participation in the mystery in ways that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. Anyone can research historical documents online, propose theories on social media, contribute to discussions about evidence, or even participate in citizen science archaeological projects. Amateur researchers have made significant contributions to our understanding of the evidence, and some of the most interesting theories have come from people working outside traditional academic institutions. The economic impact of the Lost Colony mystery on the Outer Banks region is substantial and measurable. Tourism revenue from people visiting Roanoke Island and related sites supports local businesses, creates employment for historians and tour guides, funds archaeological research projects, and generates tax revenue that supports public services. The mystery has generated millions of dollars in grant funding for universities, supported graduate students researching colonial history, created careers for people working in historical preservation and interpretation, and spawned an entire industry of books, documentaries, and educational materials. A 400-year-old tragedy has become a thriving modern business, but the commercialization of the mystery also raises uncomfortable questions about how we balance historical respect with economic opportunity. The Lost Colony represents a real human tragedy, real families who face genuine terror and probable death. Turning their story into entertainment and tourist attractions requires a delicate balance between honoring their memory and making their story accessible and engaging for modern audiences. The cultural impact of the Lost Colony extends far beyond just the specific historical mystery. It has become a template for how Americans think about disappearance, abandonment, and the vulnerability of modern society. The idea that an entire community could simply vanish resonates powerfully with contemporary anxieties about social collapse, environmental disaster, and the fragility of the systems we depend on for survival. In a world where we can track our Amazon packages in real time and locate our lost phones using satellite technology, the concept that 115 people could disappear and stay disappeared for over 400 years is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It reminds us that despite all our technology and communication systems, some things can still be lost forever. The Lost Colony has become America's most enduring mystery story, a tale that each generation rediscovers and reinterprets according to their own cultural concerns and technological capabilities. It's a story that will probably never be definitively solved, which is actually part of what makes it so compelling and valuable. In a culture that expects clear answers and definitive resolutions to every question, the Lost Colony represents the persistence of genuine mystery in human experience. It reminds us that some questions might never be answered, and sometimes the mystery itself is more interesting and meaningful than any solution could ever be. The story also serves as a reminder that American history is far more complex, mysterious, and unsettling than the sanitized versions taught in many schools. Real history involves real people facing impossible choices with incomplete information, and sometimes those people simply disappear into the unknown, leaving us to wonder and speculate about their fate across centuries. The story of the Lost Colony isn't just a historical mystery or an entertaining puzzle, it's a masterclass in how quickly things can go catastrophically wrong when you're trying to establish a new community in an unfamiliar and potentially hostile environment. The lessons from Roanoke apply far beyond 16th century colonization. They're terrifyingly relevant to anyone trying to understand how communities survive, how relationships between different cultures develop, and how people respond when everything they've planned and prepared for goes completely off the rails. The most obvious and sobering lesson from Roanoke is just how fragile early settlements really were, and by extension, how fragile all human communities are when they're operating outside their normal support systems. We tend to think of American colonial history as a steady, inevitable progression from initial settlement to eventual success, but that's only because we know how the story eventually ended, and we focus on the settlements that survive. At the time these events were happening, colonial ventures were essentially elaborate gambling operations, where people bet their lives, their families' lives, and their entire life savings on the possibility that they could build sustainable communities in completely unfamiliar environments with inadequate preparation and no backup plans. Think about the actual statistics. Roanoke failed completely, with 115 people simply vanishing. Jamestown, established 20 years later with more resources and better planning, nearly failed multiple times and survived primarily through constant resupply from England, sheer luck, and often brutal measures that would be considered war crimes today. Plymouth succeeded largely because the colonists arrived at a location where disease had already wiped out most of the local Native American population, giving them empty cleared land and dramatically reduced conflict. Early America was basically one bad winter, one failed harvest, one serious disease outbreak, or one major conflict away from complete disaster. Most colonial ventures did end in disaster, starvation, abandonment, or death. We just don't hear about all the failed settlements because dead people don't write history books and failure doesn't inspire national myths. The Roanoke story demonstrates with brutal clarity the crucial importance of maintaining good relationships with existing populations when you're trying to establish yourself in someone else's territory. The colonies that survived and eventually thrived were consistently the ones that managed to establish mutually beneficial relationships with Native American communities, learning from their expertise and finding ways to coexist productively. The colonies that failed were typically the ones that treated local peoples as obstacles to be overcome, enemies to be defeated, or resources to be exploited, rather than neighbors to be worked with on terms of mutual respect and benefit. Ralph Lane's 1585 expedition failed spectacularly because it approached colonization like a military conquest. Lane's men expected to be fed by Native Americans without offering anything valuable in return, and when cooperation wasn't immediately forthcoming, they resorted to violence, intimidation, and ultimately murder. This turned potential allies into definite enemies and made long-term survival completely impossible. John White's 1587 colony attempted a different approach based on cooperation, cultural sensitivity, and mutual benefit, but they ran into the problem of timing and external circumstances that made their good intentions largely irrelevant to their survival. The lesson here applies far beyond colonial history and remains relevant to anyone dealing with cultural differences, immigration, international relations, or even moving to a new neighborhood. When you're the newcomer in someone else's territory, your long-term success depends much more on your relationships with the existing residents than on your superior technology, weapons, or cultural confidence. Being the newcomer with advanced tools and weapons might give you short-term advantages and the ability to impose your will temporarily, but it won't help you survive and thrive if everyone who already lives there wants you to leave or die. Sustainable success requires building relationships, not just demonstrating power. Environmental challenges posed another enormous obstacle that the colonists consistently underestimated, and this lesson has become increasingly relevant as we face climate change and environmental unpredictability in our own time. The late 1580s brought severe drought to the entire region, the worst in 800 years, according to tree ring analysis, creating conditions that made survival difficult for everyone, not just the English colonists. This meant that not only were the English settlers struggling with food production in unfamiliar soil, using unfamiliar agricultural techniques, but their Native American neighbors were also dealing with crop failures and resource scarcity that made them less able or willing to share food and resources with demanding foreigners. Trying to establish a new settlement during an environmental crisis is like trying to start a business during an economic recession. Even if your basic plan is sound and would work under normal circumstances, external conditions beyond your control can make success nearly impossible, regardless of how hard you work, how well you prepare, or how much you want to succeed. Modern climate data shows that the colonists arrived during what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of generally cooler temperatures and more unpredictable weather patterns throughout the northern hemisphere. They were attempting to use English agricultural techniques in a climate that was both different from what they knew and more challenging than normal conditions in their new region. The communication problems that plagued the Roanoke colony highlight how dependent early settlements were on maintaining contact with their support systems and how quickly isolation can become deadly when you're operating at the margins of survival. John White's 3-year forced absence wasn't due to any failure on his part or lack of commitment to the colonists. It was the result of a national crisis that made private colonial ventures impossible during a period of international warfare. But from the colonists' perspective, White's failure to return as promised meant they were completely cut off from the support they had been counting on for survival. They had to make life or death decisions for their entire community based on incomplete information, with no way to get help advice or additional resources from the outside world. This isolation would have created enormous psychological pressure in addition to all the practical challenges of survival. Imagine being responsible not just for your own life, but for the lives of your family members, your children, and your entire community, with no way to call for help and no guarantee that anyone in the outside world even knows you're in trouble or cares about your fate. The colonists' response to their impossible situation, the careful dismantling of their settlement, and apparent organized relocation to a different area demonstrates remarkable community decision-making under extreme stress and uncertainty. Rather than fragmenting into competing groups, descending into panic, or abandoning collective decision-making, they appear to have made coordinated choices about how to respond to their crisis. The systematic removal of possessions and orderly abandonment of the fort suggests that the colonists maintained social cohesion and leadership structure, even when facing desperate circumstances that could easily have led to complete social breakdown. This kind of community solidarity under pressure is exactly what survival experts say is crucial for group survival in crisis situations, but it's incredibly difficult to achieve when everyone is scared, hungry, and uncertain about the future. Modern parallels to the Roanoke situation are more common than we might want to admit. Remote communities that lose contact with support systems due to natural disasters, infrastructure failures, or political upheaval. Families displaced by war, climate change, or economic collapse who have to start over in unfamiliar places with limited resources. Businesses and organizations that fail when external circumstances change beyond their control. The human challenges that the Roanoke colonists faced haven't disappeared just because we have better technology and communication systems. The psychology of abandonment that runs throughout the Roanoke story also resonates powerfully with contemporary experiences that many people can relate to personally. John White's agonizing decision to leave his family in order to get help for them, his 3-year forced separation from everyone he loved, and his ultimate failure to ever reunite with them represents a kind of family tragedy that people still experience today in different forms. Military families separated by long deployments to dangerous locations. Immigrants who leave family members behind hoping to establish themselves and bring their loved ones to safety later. Parents who make difficult decisions about their children's welfare in crisis situations, sometimes having to choose between staying together and seeking help that might save everyone. The emotional core of White's experience is unfortunately timeless and universal. The historical methodology lessons from Roanoke are equally important for understanding how we know what we know about the past and why so much history remains uncertain or contested. The mystery persists after 400 years partly because the evidence was incomplete from the very beginning and has been further degraded by time, weather, and human activity. This demonstrates how much of history is lost simply because people at the time didn't think to document things that seemed obvious or unimportant to them, or because they were too busy surviving to maintain detailed records for future historians. John White and the colonists established a communication system for staying in touch across the ocean and years, but it was designed for normal circumstances, not for 3-year separations, complete community relocations, or the breakdown of all expected support systems. The single word Croatoan carved into a post was probably perfectly clear and adequate to the colonists, but is frustratingly ambiguous to modern investigators trying to solve the mystery. This highlights how much historical interpretation depends on cultural context that can be lost over time, Documents, artifacts, and even deliberately left messages can become incomprehensible when the cultural framework that gave them meaning disappears or changes beyond recognition. The power of mystery in human culture is another fascinating lesson from the Roanoke story that reveals something important about human psychology and our relationship with the unknown. The fact that we still don't know what happened to the colonists has made their story more compelling and memorable, not less interesting. Complete information about their fate might have relegated them to a minor footnote in colonial history, just another failed settlement among many. But the unanswered questions have made them central figures in American mythology and kept their story alive in public consciousness for over 4 centuries. People seem to have a deep psychological need for stories that acknowledge the possibility that some things can't be explained, controlled, or fully understood. In a world where we expect technology to provide answers to virtually every question we can ask, the Lost Colony represents the persistence of genuine mystery in human experience. The Roanoke story reminds us that history is made up of real people who faced genuine challenges with limited information, inadequate resources, and no guarantee of success. It's easy to judge historical figures for their failures when we know how things turned out and have the benefit of hindsight, but they were making decisions based on what they knew at the time and hoping for outcomes they couldn't predict or control. The 115 people who disappeared from Roanoke Island weren't characters in a historical drama or symbols in a national mythology. They were individuals with families, hopes, fears, dreams, and very real concerns about survival who found themselves in an impossible situation and did their best to handle it with the resources and knowledge they had available. Whether they succeeded in adapting to their new circumstances or failed to overcome the challenges they faced, their courage in attempting to build new lives in an unknown world deserves respect and remembrance. Their story teaches us that human resilience and community solidarity can help people survive incredibly difficult circumstances, but it also reminds us that sometimes courage, determination, and good planning aren't enough to overcome the challenges that history, nature, and human conflict can throw at us. Their legacy isn't just the mystery of their disappearance, it's the reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it, and that the American story includes not just the successes we celebrate, but also the failures, tragedies, and unresolved mysteries that shaped our national character just as profoundly. So there you have it, folks, the absolutely mind-bending, heart-wrenching, completely unsolved story of 115 people who walked into American history and never walked out. We've followed their incredible journey from the delusional dreams and get-rich-quick schemes that brought them to America, through their desperate attempt at building new lives in a wilderness that wanted them dead, to that final bone-chilling moment when they simply evaporated into the American frontier, leaving behind only questions that we're still trying to answer 4 centuries later. Think about the absolutely staggering human drama we've just explored together. John White, the grandfather who sailed away from his daughter and 9-day-old granddaughter, thinking he'd be back in a few months with supplies, only to be trapped in England for 3 agonizing years while his family faced unknown horrors an ocean away. Eleanor Dare, who gave birth to the first English child in America and then disappeared before her daughter's 3rd birthday. Virginia Dare herself, who entered the world as a symbol of hope for English America and vanished into history before she could even speak her own name. We're talking about 3 entire families worth of people who just vanished into the American wilderness like they were abducted by aliens, except this actually happened. A grandfather who spent his final years wondering what happened to his family, probably blaming himself every single day until he died. A mother trying to raise a newborn in a fort surrounded by forests, swamps, and people who might want her family dead. An entire community of 115 souls who left behind only one word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. The emotional weight of this story hits completely differently when you remember that these weren't characters in some Netflix historical drama. They were real people with real families who faced genuine pants-wetting terror and uncertainty. They sold everything they owned to buy passage to America. They crossed an ocean that regularly killed people just for fun to start new lives in a place they knew almost nothing about. And then they simply disappeared, leaving us to wonder and speculate about their fate for over 400 years. Compare this to our modern missing persons cases, and the difference is absolutely staggering. We get Amber Alerts when one child disappears. We mobilize massive search efforts involving helicopters, dogs, and hundreds of volunteers when a single hiker goes missing in a national park. We have 24-hour news coverage when a plane vanishes over the ocean. Imagine if 115 people, men, women, and children, just vanished overnight from your community, leaving only a cryptic message behind. The panic, the search efforts, the media coverage, the investigation would be absolutely overwhelming and never-ending. But in 1590, 115 people could disappear and stay disappeared with no way for the outside world to even know they were missing until someone happened to sail by and notice the empty settlement. The story of the lost colony makes you appreciate things we completely take for granted in ways that'll change how you see your daily life. Google Maps and GPS navigation mean we always know exactly where we are and how to get where we're going. Cell phone service means we can call for help from almost anywhere on the planet. Emergency services mean that if something goes wrong, trained professionals with modern equipment and helicopters will come looking for us within hours. The Roanoke colonists had absolutely none of these advantages. They were completely cut off from everything they had known before trying to build new lives, with no backup plan, no way to get help if things went wrong, and no guarantee that anyone in England even remembered they existed or cared about their fate. They had less information about their new home than we have about Mars. Seriously, think about that. We have detailed satellite maps of Mars. We know its atmospheric composition. We understand its weather patterns. We've analyzed its soil composition. The Roanoke colonists knew basically nothing about America, except that it existed. And Spain was making money there somehow. They were crossing the Atlantic using technology that was essentially medieval and trying to establish a permanent settlement using the survival skills of English farmers who had never seen American wildlife, American weather, or American diseases. The colonists faced challenges that we can barely imagine. No communication with the outside world for months or years at a time. No medical care beyond primitive remedies that were more likely to kill you than cure you. No reliable food sources, no protection from severe weather, no way to predict or prepare for natural disasters, and no guarantee that their neighbors wouldn't decide to kill them all. Every single decision could mean the difference between life and death for their entire community. Every mistake could doom everyone they loved. Every day they survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. But here's what's absolutely incredible. The story also highlights human capabilities that we sometimes forget we possess in our comfortable modern world. The colonists' apparent ability to make collective decisions under extreme pressure, their systematic preparation for relocating their entire community, and their maintenance of social cohesion, even when facing desperate circumstances, demonstrate remarkable resilience and community solidarity that puts most modern communities to shame. When everything went wrong, and I mean everything, they didn't panic. They didn't fragment into competing groups. They didn't abandon their most vulnerable members. They made rational decisions as a community about how to respond to their crisis, and they apparently executed those decisions with remarkable organization and care. The Lost Colony holds an absolutely unique place in American origin mythology that most people don't fully appreciate. Unlike other colonial settlements that eventually succeeded and grew into major communities, Roanoke represents the road not taken, the alternative history, where English colonization failed completely, and 115 people simply vanished into the American wilderness before America was even officially America. Roanoke reminds us that American success was never guaranteed, never inevitable, never predetermined by manifest destiny or divine providence. The colonies that survived did so through an incredible combination of planning, adaptation, luck, brutal pragmatism, and often morally questionable decisions that we prefer not to think about too carefully. For every success story like Plymouth or Jamestown that we celebrate in our national mythology, there were multiple failures like Roanoke where entire communities disappeared, died, or were abandoned after facing challenges they couldn't overcome. The mystery also reflects something essential and deeply unsettling about American character, our simultaneous fascination with disappearance and transformation, our belief in the possibility of starting over completely, and our terror of being abandoned or forgotten. The idea that people could simply vanish into the American frontier and reinvent themselves completely resonates with cultural themes that appear throughout American literature, mythology, and our national conception of who we are. Virginia Dare, as the first English child born in America, represents both the ultimate promise and the ultimate vulnerability of the American experience. She was literally the first American born into a situation that embodied both the hope of new beginnings and the terror of complete isolation from everything familiar and safe. The fact that we still don't know what happened to her or to any of the other colonists adds an element of tragic mystery to the very foundation of American identity. Complete information might have made them just another footnote in colonial history, but the unanswered questions have made them central figures in our national imagination and permanent reminders that the American story includes not just triumphs, but also tragedies and unsolved mysteries. What do you think really happened to the Lost Colony? Did they integrate with friendly Native American tribes and live out their lives as Americans in the most literal sense possible? Did they try to sail back to England on their own when John White didn't return and disappear somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean? Did they move inland and establish a settlement that was later destroyed or absorbed by other communities? Which theory do you find most convincing, and why? The Croatoan Island theory, based on the carved message and archaeological evidence on Hatteras Island. The integration theory, suggesting they dispersed among multiple Native American communities and their descendants are still alive today. The Chesapeake connection, proposing they finally tried to reach their original destination, or one of the disaster scenarios that assumes they didn't survive long after John White's departure. Do you think we'll ever solve this mystery definitively, or is this one of those historical puzzles that will remain forever unsolved? Modern archaeological and scientific techniques have provided tantalizing new evidence, but haven't produced the smoking gun that would finally answer the question. Will future technology reveal the truth, or are some mysteries meant to stay mysterious? What would you have done in John White's impossible situation? Would you have left your family to seek help from England, knowing that you might never see them again? Or would you have stayed with the colony and risked everyone starving together? There were no good options, only terrible choices with potentially catastrophic consequences either way. How do you think the colonists felt when White didn't return as promised, and months turned into years with no sign of the relief expedition they were counting on? How did they maintain hope and community solidarity? What kind of conversations did they have about their options and their future? What was it like to realize that England had apparently abandoned them to die in the wilderness? Thanks for joining me on this absolutely incredible journey back to colonial America and into one of our nation's oldest and most persistent mysteries. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the story of people who risked literally everything for the dream of America and became part of history in ways they never could have imagined. The Lost Colony of Roanoke reminds us that history is full of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances with courage, determination, and hope, even when they couldn't control the outcome of their efforts or guarantee their own survival. Whether the colonists survived by joining native tribes, died from disease and disaster, or met some other fate, we'll never understand. They were real people who loved their families, hoped for better lives, and made the ultimate sacrifice for their vision of what America could become. We may never know what happened to them, but we can remember their courage and honor their story. They were pioneers in the truest sense, people who ventured into the unknown, not because they were fearless, but because they believed the possibilities were worth the risks, even when those risks included death, disappearance, and being forgotten by history. In our modern world of instant communication, satellite tracking, and emergency services, it's almost impossible to imagine how people could simply disappear and stay disappeared for over 400 years. But the Lost Colony reminds us that some mysteries persist despite all our technological advances, and sometimes the questions are more compelling and meaningful than any answers could ever be. The story also teaches us that American success was built on the sacrifices and courage of people like the Roanoke colonists, individuals who risked everything for the possibility of building something new and better in the New World. Not all of them survived to see their dreams fulfilled, but their courage and determination helped make possible the America we know today. Should we explore more colonial mysteries in future videos? Would you like to investigate other famous disappearances in American history? Or would you prefer we dive into different types of unsolved historical cases that'll blow your mind just as much as this one? Let me know in the comments which direction you'd like to see this channel take, because trust me, we've got a whole warehouse full of historical nightmare fuel waiting to be explored. And absolutely demolish that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into America's most disturbing and fascinating historical mysteries, because our nation's past is full of stories that are stranger, more compelling, and more mysterious than any fiction writer could ever invent. The Lost Colony of Roanoke reminds us that sometimes the most important stories are the ones without endings, the mysteries that acknowledge the limits of human knowledge, and the persistence of wonder in our understanding of the past. In a world that expects definitive answers to every question, the 115 people who vanished from Roanoke Island represent the beautiful and terrifying possibility that some things will always remain unknown. Their story lives on not because we solved their mystery, but because we remember their humanity and honor their courage in facing an uncertain fate with dignity and hope. That's a lesson worth carrying forward regardless of what really happened to them in the end. And hey, maybe someday you'll be the one to finally solve America's oldest mystery. Stranger things have happened, and the truth is still out there, waiting to be discovered by someone with the right combination of curiosity, determination, and luck. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if you're ever wondering where those 115 people went, just look around. Their legacy is America itself.